meetings. Okay, members, we're quorate, so we'll declare the meeting open to the public. Thank you. And just the usual housekeeping, could I advise members about the appropriate use of their electronic devices and so on, and keep the telephone switched off. Can any member who has any interest relevant to today's agenda please declare them? None to declare, then we move on then to apologies. We have apologies from Paul and Bradley. Any other apologies to record? No, so move on then to the next item. Draft minutes, page 5 of your pack. Are members content then with the draft minutes for the meeting of the 18th of September 2014? Members are content, agreed. Thank you. Chairperson of Business, just to advise members that I will be attending the CO3 event, which is organised by Assembly Outreach. That's on the 7th of October. I think it's like a round table event. I think there's a number of chairs and vice chairs and committees invited to attend that event. Okay, matters arising. You'll see there from, I've actually just received a letter from Mervyn Story, the new Minister for Social Development, and you'll find that at the top of your table pack. It's just been brought into the meeting actually. So I'm content just to note that, and obviously, as you'll see from the letter, the Minister is looking forward to working with the committee on it next remainder of the term. Okay, so we just acknowledge that, and we'll arrange the relevant meetings with Mervyn as soon as possible. Okay, so again, members, then under matters arising, you'll note there on page 13 of your pack, the Central Committee Office has produced the figures for attendance. The members have the opportunity to check the accuracy of that for themselves and get content with that. Okay, so great, thanks very much. Item number 4 is DSD Special Advisor, the fact-finding exercise. The paper is relevant on page 15. You'll note that we did receive a response from the former Minister now and regarding that fact-finding exercise. That was emailed out to members on Friday last, 19th of September, and that's included on page 16. I just want to make the point that there's been a number of issues related to this over a number of months. I think I reported this previously and members will be aware of it. So there's been some correspondence between this committee and the department on this, and that's from page 18 onwards in your pack actually. So you've noted the response that the committee requested that we would have say to that, and we've been told basically we can't. And as I said, we've tabled for your information the correspondence between ourselves and the department over a period of time, and that's from page 18. It's just a matter of us to decide what we want to do about that. Thank you, Brady.
Thanks, Chair. I mean, I think the fact is it is a fact-finding exercise. It's not an inquiry as such. There's nothing in the Minister's letter to indicate how confidential or otherwise or what any of the findings are, because obviously we haven't seen it, so we're not in a position to comment. I mean, is there any way that we can pursue this to get a copy of that report?
Well, we'll have an option of examining the prospect of a Section 44 notice. Jim and then Dolores.
Yeah, I must say, I think having sat on it for so long, to then treat the committee in the contemptuous way that the former Minister has treated us is quite disgraceful. Mr. Brimstone was being investigated as a temporary civil servant. He was being investigated as to whether or not he had breached the Civil Service Handbook Code of Ethics, as well as the Special Advisor's Code of Conduct. And it's very significant that that investigation was initiated by the Permanent Secretary, because he is a civil servant. It was the Permanent Secretary, not the Minister. And therefore the Permanent Secretary seems to me to be the person who should have been in receipt of Mr. Lewis's report back from DFP. And yet it seems that in a quite high-handed way the Minister has intervened, taken control, and he who has a most patent vested interest in the matter has decided that what action will or won't be taken, including the fact that he will conceal from this committee the outcome of a fact-finding investigation at a time when this committee is involved in an investigation germane to that very issue. It's a totally contemptuous way to treat this committee. And I certainly think we should be looking at Section 44. I think we also should give the new minister an opportunity to review the decision. I think we should invite him to review it, because I think it is, as I say, quite contemptible way in which we've been treated.
Sorry, Sammy. Dolores.
Thank you, Chair. Just reading through some of the information last night on the involvement of the Permanent Secretary, and the next stage is whether or not there would be a disciplinary panel as a possible outcome. I mean, who makes those decisions, and does the Permanent Secretary or anyone else have a role to play? And then, given, I believe, Jenny Palmer's concerns about being kept in the dark in relation to her cooperation with the investigation, you know, I think there was a reasonable expectation in her that she would know the outcome and be given a copy of the report. So can we ascertain what courtesies are being extended to her as the affected party?
Okay. Gregory?
Was it me or Sammy?
No, you indicated Sammy didn't. Sammy just tried to speak, so you indicated. So bring Sammy in next.
I had to take a call there. Apologies for having to go out. I think what we need to do is establish if the now former minister, as he maintained in the letter, carried out the function that he was entitled to carry out, did what he was within the remit of his powers to carry out in terms of his investigation of what a special advisor did, and what was there any action that he has indicated to the committee that he has taken that was in any way ultra vires what he could do? Now, I think I'll reserve what comments I make until we get the answer to that. But that's the key answer. All the other extraneous stuff we can all deal with when we find out that. Was he acting ultra vires, or was he within what he could, should and did do? That's the key. When we get that, we can then make a lot of comments.
Okay. Sammy?
Well, and just in addition to that, the Minister has made it clear in his response to us that the legal advice is that he can and should be the person who deals with any outcome from the fact-finding exercise. And indeed, if you look through all of the letters, which there have been previously, the only indication, the only promise that was made was that the committee would be informed of the outcome, not of the process, not of the findings, but the outcome. And I mean, if the Minister is legally entitled to deal with this himself, then you know the response we've got is clearly perfectly adequate.
Before we bring back in, just my own point of view, I mean, if you look at the correspondence throughout the past year, I certainly, and I don't know what's in the report, so I can only make a judgment on what's in the report if and when I ever see it. It's completely germane to the committee inquiry, and I feel that the correspondence between this committee and the department over the past while, and the ultimate response to be got from the Minister, it's this committee in an absolute disingenuous and contemptuous manner, and I want to put that on the record. So I certainly would be very, very supportive of exploring what we can do to access that. It's a bit unusual in one sense because there will be people giving evidence here specifically directly relating to matters. So we'll be dealing with these matters anyhow. So, as I say, I just want to place on the record, I feel that we've been treated in a very disingenuous and contemptuous manner over a period of months, and the correspondence, in my view, underlines that. That's my opinion.
The Minister probably said it's been reciprocated as well. So,
he says in his letter, in accordance with long-established principle, would not be appropriate to disclose this report. He seems to be indicating there's a precedent set for this, and it would be interesting to find out have other reports, fact-finding reports, not been issued to committees, for instance, because that's what he seems to be implying, that there's a precedent already in place And, I'm not sure how often this kind of thing would have happened, because this inquiry, in a sense, is the first of its kind. So because it's unique in that sense, how could a precedent possibly have been set? It's just a question I would...
But I mean, based on what I've been hearing so far, and obviously we can take a vote on it, but certainly my view would be that I certainly would, as I said earlier on, would support the call for disclosure of that document to this committee. We should seek to understand from legal advice ourselves whether we can compel it or not. I certainly would be supporting compelling for that. But Tim, you want to back in again?
Yeah, the Minister, or the ex-Minister's, hiding behind legal advice he says he got. Well, of course, if he's the one who invited the legal advice, he can waive the privilege on it. And I think we should, if we're writing to the new Minister, ask him to consider waiving the privilege on that advice and sharing it with us, as well as reviewing the decision. I certainly support the idea that we should take our own advice on our options.
I'm presuming that I was bringing in the second, Greg. I mean, I would presume that all of these matters may well ultimately fall to the new Minister just because he's the head of the department. But at this stage again, I would be, personally speaking, a bit loath to kind of embroil the new Minister on this matter in the first instance. So, I mean, I think we should I would be more comfortable, I suppose, in sense it's just saying let us seek our own legal advice. Get the legal advisors here next week to advise us on our next steps, with the view to, if needs be, compelling disclosure of that fact-finding exercise report. So that would be my view, rather than necessarily put it on the desk of the Minister. I mean, I presume it will be there anyway as the new Minister. Gregory?
Yeah, just on the issue of whether the committee decides to proceed down the route of trying to compel some sort of discovery, is that through the use of the Article 44?
Yeah. Well, it may well be available to us. I don't know where it is or not, so...
Right. Now, this then would be the same route that we discussed at quite some length, that we would go down against the BBC. We're at the very centre of this entire investigation, without whose programme there wouldn't be an investigation.
Well, that remains to be seen.
Which does? Which remains to be seen?
It's not exclusively down the BBC. I mean, a lot of members had
But if there had been no programme, there would be no investigation, Chairman.
That's your opinion, but
It's not an opinion, it's a fact.
It doesn't matter. It's not...
Had there been no Spotlight programme, we would not have been sitting here for 16 months.
Fair enough.
It is entirely because of the content, the erroneous content of the Spotlight programme. It's a matter of opinion that it's erroneous. It is not a matter of opinion that it's the programme that has caused us to be here. No programme, no investigation. It's as simple as that. Now, for months we talked about and discussed about the merits or demerits of going down the 44 to compel the BBC to sit here. For many months we discussed that, and we did not, for reasons that we've all had explained to us, we did not proceed with that. Is somebody now seriously suggesting that because we didn't adopt that route against the people who are at the core of why we're investigating, we're now going to adopt it now against the former Minister? Because he, and we have to find out yet whether he was entirely within his rights in carrying out the actions that he did in terms of his special advisor, but we're still going to deploy that sort of nuclear option that we declined to do so against the people at the heart of the investigation.
But how are we going to find out if he was within his rights?
That'll be
Same
a
way as we
matter...
found out with the BBC. We
Sorry,
didn't.
gentlemen, that decision will be a matter for the committee to decide once, if the decision is taken to seek legal advice. When we get the legal advice, the committee will decide, and it will decide on any discussion around Articles 44 or any other course of action. It's entirely down to the committee to make its own decision, issue by issue, day by day, week by week. That's what committees do, as you well know. So, you may not be happy with the outcome of the BBC. Neither am I, by the way, for the record. I don't think anybody around this table has been happy with the responses we've been getting overall from the BBC in terms of attending this committee. But we're dealing with another issue today, so we'll deal with that today and we'll take a decision on this one way or the other. Stuart?
Yeah, I'll add to this, Chairman. Obviously it's a matter for the committee. The entirety of our discussion and where we take the investigation is a matter for the committee. The point I'm making is that the committee declined to go down the route that it is contemplating possibly going down now against the people who are at the very core of why we're here. But they seem to be prepared to do so against the former minister. That's the point I'm making.
Well, you'll recall that people had very strident views about the BBC, but when we got our legal advice, we dealt with it on the basis of legal advice. We may well have legal advice if we seek that, which will tell us there's no point pursuing Article 44, and then we not do that, I presume. So the committee will make its mind up on the basis of the legal opinions that it receives, and will make a judgment on that. And I can't foretell what that decision will be of the committee. Stuart?
Chair, I agree that we should seek a legal opinion, but I think it goes slightly wider than that. That this does go to the core of the relationship between a special advisor, a minister, and their relationship to a department. I think we're due a clear explanation, and indeed a copy of all the documents that relate to the recruitment, appointment, the rights of investigation, discipline, etc., with regards to special advisors. And I think we should be writing to the head of the civil service, in addition to any legal advice that we might receive, because not only are there legal issues around this, but there are also important employment relations issues around this. And I think those are the bits that we need to get a clear understanding of as well. So I'd encourage the committee to consider writing to the head of the civil service to ask him to set out very clearly and in writing for us the relationship, the contractual relationship, and the rights of who has the right to do what in relation to inquiries and investigations into allegations of misconduct by individuals at that level within the civil service, and in that particular and rather peculiar relationship that a special advisor
I
has.
think that not any difficulty with that.
Yeah, I agree with that. Mr. Brimstone's acting as a civil servant.
Okay, so there's a proposition that we would seek legal opinion with a view to compelling, if needs be, disclosure of that fact-finding exercise report. Those in favour?
Sorry, what's the proposal?
The proposal is that we seek legal advice from Assembly Legal Services in relation to this, with a view to, if needs be, compelling, if we can, if needs be, seeking to compel disclosure of the fact-finding exercise report.
Yeah, I had suggested in my initial comments, Chairman, that we find out if the Minister was acting within his appropriate remit and how he deals with the special advisor.
I mean, I would suggest that would form part of the discussion when we get the legal service, because they're going to tell us whether the Minister is acting within the legal variations.
Yeah, but the proposal would appear to jump ahead of that, though.
Well, the proposal to get, I mean, to be honest with you, the essence of the proposal is we get legal advice and then we discuss all these matters when we get the legal advisors in the room. That's the simple.
Yes, but
That's not what I understood.
the proposal is not that. The proposal is that we seek legal advice as to whether or not we can use Article 44 to get this information. What Gregory is saying is that the first step is to find out if the Minister was acting within the legal powers that were available to him, to deal with this himself. Then and only then could you then jump to the next step. But I mean, it's in your enthusiasm to try and get to a conclusion which you've already reached, you're prepared to ignore that first step.
You really should desist from trying to tell me how I think and what I have to say. I think I'll decide.
It's fairly
like
good
your
grounds
party
for it,
leader.
Chairman.
I think it's fairly
I'll
obvious.
decide when I make my mind up on any matter, and you'll be the first to know that. So I'm quite prepared to take legal advice, and we will do that, and I'll act in concert with that legal advice and stick my teeth to that. So people shouldn't make any presumptions, because it only makes a fool of people when they do that, particularly when they get it so wrong. Dolores?
Chair, there are two slightly separate matters, but that complement each other. One is you can ask for legal advice on whether or not the Minister acted ultra vires, and the second is, does the committee have the right to invoke Section 44 to compel the report? There you are.
Well, that's the point I was going to make. It is as simple as that, because you're not going to get legal advice in twice to ask him essentially the same question. That would make a lot of sense. So the first question, is he within his legal rights? The second question is, if he's not, then presumably you take it from there. But you'll get legal advice on both those issues from the same legal advisor, I would assume.
Like, I'm more than happy, I'm more than happy to have the motion rephrased to say, let's take legal advice on this and we make our decision based on the legal advice. I'm quite happy
I
with
would have thought would have been the more appropriate way.
Okay, so those in favour?
If the committee, a majority, haven't already made up their mind what they think the outcome is.
that. Well, I mean, again, you're making
I
us.
haven't made any
But
assumption.
with respect, Chair,
Anyway,
I think,
sorry, I'm not
I think
taking
there's
any
only
more.
one of us here that's legally qualified,
All right.
but I'm certainly not.
Okay, let's
Okay, I can't make that
just
decision.
stick to the single item, single motion on this. So, is those in favour of seeking legal advice on this matter? Those against? Okay, that's carried. So, okay, so Kevin and we'll arrange that. Thank you, five members. Okay.
Well, what about Stuart's proposal? We write to the head of the civil service, asking for him to set out for us the relationships and who's responsible for who in terms of special advisors.
Members content with that?
And Chair, could we include a question as to what information has been shared with Jenny Palmer?
You may not
Is that
know.
not a separate?
Yeah.
Is that not like an additional bit?
Well, it may well be, but, you know, yeah.
Look, that's because that's a simple, straightforward.
Okay.
Is Stuart's proposal then, is that a generic proposal?
Yeah.
Find that out?
It is, and it is to see the baseline relationship as set out in writing between civil service and their departments.
And then can we deal with yours? So, members agree with that?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, members, for that. And then I'll suggest, I mean, we're going to come on to just in terms of dealing with evidence sessions on the second or two door, so I'd ask you just to suspend your views on that last
That's
item
okay.
for a second or two. Okay, so just to say that the committee, we had actually postponed, if you like, inviting the respective advisor and Councillor Jenny Palmer to give evidence in respect of phase 3 of the inquiry due to this ongoing issue being unresolved. With phase 3 of your tabled items there, just draw attention to the proposed witness schedule, and that would have Jenny Palmer scheduled for the 9th of October. Okay. Yes. Yeah, and you'll see on that there, on the bottom of that page there, on that page 3, you'll see at the bottom, Stephen Brimstone and the Minister to be scheduled. And I think I spoke to Kevin about this just yesterday, and I would have thought it would have been probably in terms of the scheduling, sequencing of this, that we would have Jenny Palmer in on the 9th of October, and we should also probably have Stephen Brimstone invited in to give evidence on that same day, but obviously not at the same table at the same time. Members content with that?
Right.
Okay, thank you for that.
Councillor Palmer is described as a former board member. Is this the situation? Is she no longer a board member?
Sorry, I think it might be an error.
Yeah.
I think it's an
I
error.
thought you were still a
Yes, yes.
Most of the witnesses are formers, I see.
Yeah.
Is it?
There were some changes to
Okay. Well, anyway, whatever. So I'm not sure, Jim, is my answer. So
So we'll clarify that and we'll let members know. Maybe that would be-
okay. The members content then, just to note that scheduling. Okay, members. Then moving on to then item 5 of the agenda, which is really the inquiry. So we're moving in the inquiry session here, and we have. This morning here, in terms of being asked to give evidence to this inquiry, is a briefing by former Housing Executive Acting CEO Stuart Cuddy. Stuart, you're very welcome to the meeting here this morning.
Thank you.
Remind members, obviously this is in relation to phase 3 of the committee's inquiry, and the information provided, the submission provided by Stuart Cuddy is in page 35 of your packet. Okay, sure. So again, to remind members and remind yourself that obviously you've been invited here to provide evidence to the committee for our inquiry, and you had been asked to give us a submission, and you kindly agreed to do that. I reminded people that's on page 35. So are you happy enough, Stuart, that you understand the remit of this particular phase of the inquiry and the reason why you're here? You've given a submission, you're content that that submission is appropriate. Do you want to add anything or make any opening remarks or whatever?
No, the only other thing I want to say, Chairman, so as the committee are aware, is I understand you've already had some witnesses and evidence, and I believe that may be in the public domain. I haven't seen that, I'm not aware of it, so I'm coming really from the basis of what I've prepared and the fact that I retired about 18 months ago.
Okay. We join your retirement. Okay, so members from Han, you were looking.
Chair, you're welcome, Stuart, this morning at the committee, and it went over the information that you provided. And there was a meeting that took place on the 30th of June 2011, where you had asked the Minister why he was so interested in the Red Sky contract, and you were accused by the Minister's Special Advisor that you were making allegations. And I think as a result of this meeting, you asked for the Permanent Secretary to be present at any further meeting. And could you explain why? Did they feel under pressure?
No, I think maybe I didn't make it sufficiently clear. I think there were two meetings,
Yeah.
And there is a minute or a draft minute of one of those meetings, and I think I said in my briefing that was the first time when the papers were given to me several weeks ago or several months ago. That was the first time I saw that minute, and in that minute it says that I had asked for the Permanent Secretary to be present at that meeting because he wasn't there. And in fact, if you read the draft minute, it said that he then came later to that meeting. I also asked in that meeting for the Minister's request to extend the Red Sky contract, which he had asked us to do at that meeting, to be put in writing. And the reason I did that was, and I think I spell out in quite a lot of detail, I was very, very concerned that, first of all, a minister was asking us to do something about a public contract. And really, for me, with over 30 years' experience in the public sector, that is the first time a minister or a senior manager would have come to me or to my colleagues and asked them to get involved in a public procurement. Because everybody knows public procurement and contracts, there are codes of ethics, there are protocols and procedures, and you don't breach those. So I was very, very concerned, and I thought, surely the Minister is aware of that, and if he's not aware of that, his Permanent Secretary should be advising him. And that is why I asked for the Permanent Secretary to be there. And because, as I go on to explain, the Permanent Secretary is the Senior Accounting Officer, in the sense that I also was the Accounting Officer for the Housing Executive. But as the Senior Accounting Officer, he was also overall responsibility for the Housing Executive. And I felt it was absolutely vital that he would advise the Minister, look, you need to be very, very careful here. You're getting involved in a very detailed operational contract issue, particularly where that contractor was subject to an investigation, had been found to be providing a service that was poor quality and there was overcharging. And it was really from that perspective, that was the one thing I was really very concerned about.
It's just 2 points raising.
Sorry, could I just clarify? I wasn't quite clear whether it was at that meeting or the other meeting that I was accused of making an allegation. And it may have been that meeting, but it wasn't minuted. It clearly is not in the draft minute. And the reason, even in the most difficult meetings, occasionally there can be a bit of humour. When I was told I was making an allegation, it was reinforced by the Special Advisor said to me, a fool would know that it's an allegation. And I felt like saying, well, I'm not a fool, therefore it's not an allegation, it's a question. But I thought perhaps that was maybe inappropriate, bearing in mind the tension in that meeting.
Sure. And I've just got over some of the stuff. There was 2 meetings. There was one on the 30th of June and one on the one on Tuesday, the 28th of June. And I think the 20th of June refers to
the question about the minister. But the point I was going to make, first of all, did you feel that you were getting put under pressure by the minister, special advisor, whoever else, to rescind the decision to take the contract away from Red Sky? And secondly, what was the attitude to the permanent secretary when he came along to the meeting to deal with the question that you had raised?
Obviously, we're talking about some time ago, so my recall in terms of the detail is maybe not 100% accurate. I mean, we have felt, both the chairman and I felt under an awful lot of pressure. Of course we did, and that is why I felt it was important that the permanent secretary should be there, because he, at the end of the day, is the advisor to the minister in that sense, in terms of relation to matters relating to ethics, policy, procedures, and protocols. But what we did do then, and I don't know if this is in your papers, following that meeting, the chairman and I went back and we drafted a letter. And there was a letter dated the 1st of July, which was sent to the permanent secretary. And I don't know if that letter is in your papers or not. I kept a copy of that because I felt it was such an important letter. And that set out all our concerns. I have a copy here which I can refer to. It's the 1st of July, and on the second page there are something like 5 bullet points. I don't know if the committee members have this letter.
Should be second. We'll check it. Claire's going to check the record here. We'll be second. Here, if you don't mind.
Yeah. I mean, it details all our concerns there about why we felt that what had been asked for at that meeting really was unacceptable, and really we were hoping at that stage that perhaps the civil service would maybe speak to the minister and perhaps explain if they hadn't done already. And of course maybe they have done, because we were not aware of any discussions or indeed written advice that may have come from the permanent secretary. In fact, I'm still not aware if the permanent secretary had given the minister advice in writing or orally and what the content of that was. So we were making it very, very clear, look, there's a major issue here, and really you need to back off and let us get on with what we're doing. We have a contractor here who has performed very poorly. In fact, although I haven't said it in my briefing, it was referred to the PSNI for the possibility of potential fraud in terms of that overcharging. And for a minister to request us to extend a contract, but a contract involving that type of contractor, I mean, it would be not acceptable. It would be unacceptable from anybody. If I went as a senior manager to any of my staff or procurement and asked them to do that, the first thing they'd do is they'd report me, and I would be subject to disciplinary procedure, and I would probably be sacked.
Okay, sure, thank you. We're still trying to locate this.
Could I ask them a final question just while we're moving it? There has been suggestions and allegations made that the reason that the Red Sky contract, or part of the reason, was sectarianism used against the company, and some of yours. But I think even in your documentation, you're saying that that's not the case. It was for poor work and for overcharging.
Absolutely. I mean, and I was absolutely, no, I won't say I was shocked, because I'm not naive. I was very, very surprised at that allegation. And if you look at the composition of our board, I mean, our board are made up of, or were made up of members from different backgrounds and different communities. And yet the decision of the board was unanimous. There was no question, and in fact, if I had thought it had been tainted in any way with sectarianism, I would have had no party with it whatsoever, and I would have recorded that concern in writing.
Okay, sure. Is this pack here, and the hard copy? We don't have it on the electronic, no? If anybody has a hard copy, or it's a tab 10, that last correspondence. Is that on here, isn't it? have an outside there, which is actually in the written page 99, and then page 100 after that, Annex B.
Page 106, that's a response.
That's what's put on in.
Sure, but just see on that and the response back from the minister. I can't see a response back from the permanent secretary.
No, I mean, the correspondence, when I was looking at this with fresh eyes, having been away for so long, you'll see the minister responded or wrote on the 1st of July. Now, I can't remember whether that letter came in before the chairman wrote his letter. My recollection was that the chairman was writing a letter based on our concerns at the meeting we had just had the previous day or 2 days before. And if you look at the first page and you come to 1, 2, 3, the fourth paragraph in that letter of the 1st of July from the chairman, we talk about it being incomprehensible why the minister, and really, I mean, that is not overstating it. We were absolutely stunned at the request to extend this contract. And then on the following page, we list 5 reasons why, again, we couldn't understand how you could justify such a request. And then the very last paragraph was the chairman trying to diffuse the situation, saying, look, here's the reasons why we feel this is totally inappropriate. Can you now back off? And he's making the point that it's the minister, and he also refers to the Department for Social Development, because we believe there is a role there. And I don't want to be unfair to the Department for Social Development. They may have already. I haven't seen their evidence or advice. They may have tried to advise the minister. Therefore, I don't want to in any way criticise them at this stage.
Yeah. Chairman, what I'm trying to find out is that there was a request that the permanent secretary attend the meeting from yourselves. What was his attitude also at the allegations that were being made during the meeting with yourselves?
I don't think at that stage. I think if I could refer back to maybe the minute of that meeting, I think the permanent secretary's attitude from recollection was, look, we need to try and address these issues. I don't think he wanted to open this up because he realised that there had been a very tense and heated discussion. And I think his reaction was, look, I want to try and calm this down, because it probably was at that meeting where I was accused of making an allegation and I was incensed, insisting it's not an allegation. And therefore I think the permanent secretary's attitude was, look, the issues are out, the minister has made his request to you, let's now, we've heard your response, let's see how we take it from here. And of course, when we got back, we said, look, we need to put this in writing. And then, of course, the minister wrote to us.
Did you write to the permanent secretary after the meeting, or was it just?
Well, my understanding, I mean, that letter of the 1st of July is to Will Hare, the secretary. That is directly after the meeting where we had been asked to extend the contract. I think that's the timeline.
And did he not respond at all? I can't see any.
I can't see any. I can't see anything.
Of August.
I'm told here on tab 9 you'll have minutes of a meeting and the DSD briefing prepared, or in the minute at tab 9.
So I don't know if he responded to that, but I couldn't see in the papers that were sent to me. Is there a letter on the 1st of August?
On the 31st of August, tab 10, page 109, there's a letter to Mr. Roundtree from Mr. Hare.
I don't know what's in that.
But say that while there's a letter from yourselves to Will Hare, there was no response from Will Hare on some of the difficulties you were facing. Right?
Sorry, say that again.
There was no written response from Will Hare on the response or the letter that you had wrote off.
Well, unless this letter the members have referred to deals with those issues.
Commented on, but the response came from the minister.
Well, the letter,
Right, Chair, if you don't mind.
I think those two
Claire's
letters
gonna-
passed
Claire's
at the
going to give you a folder
Yeah.
which will contain some
The
of
letter from the Minister and the Chairman's letter passed at the same time, so I would imagine it wasn't in response, it was in response to the meeting. I do remember, before I look at this, there was a letter from Mr Hare sometime afterwards, but by that stage, the issue, the denouement, the matter had finally been put to bed. And the Minister had already written saying, look, in light of what you've now said, the Red Sky or the ministers can't extend the contract and manage it, therefore go ahead and proceed to allocate to the adjacent contractors. A letter then came in, I think, after that from the Permanent Secretary, who I think was quite annoyed that the Chairman had written in very strong terms to him, and that may be the letter that you have now referred me to.
Yeah.
You're on the list number.
Yes. The Permanent Secretary seems to be saying that he can proffer advice, but at the end of the day, it's up to the Minister. Now, I've worked in the public sector for 37, 38 years. All of that time has been, except for a short period, has been within the public sector as opposed to the civil service. But my understanding is, and the committee may want to check this out, that there are protocols and policies whereby if a minister does not or is not prepared to accept advice, there is recourse then for the civil service to refer that matter up the line in some way. Now, I don't know what that protocol or procedure is, but there is a way of dealing with this. I would be surprised in such a serious matter as public procurement, which is a taboo issue. Everybody knows public contracts, you do not get involved in those because there are protocols that have to be followed. There are people who are dealing with those, and if they step out of line, they will be subject to disciplinary action. Therefore, in a situation like this, I would have thought the advice needs to be very, very forceful. It needs to be in writing so that the Permanent Secretary can cover his back for no other reason.
Okay. Right, thank you. Jim, I have Jim Delora saying something.
Yeah, your statement of evidence is very clear as to what you thought about this. Just to stay for a moment with the meetings at the end of June and in the correspondence into July, the Minister, after the June meetings, wrote on the 1st of July, expressly asking the board to extend the contract for a period of 6 months.
Yes.
What was your understanding of why he wanted it extended for 6 months?
We didn't know. We had no idea. That was why the question was asked at the meeting, and maybe it was from me inappropriately worded because I was so taken aback, and I said, why are you so interested in Red Sky? So, I mean, the question really was, why do you want us to do this?
Why did it seem to you the Minister was so interested in Red Sky?
Well, we could speculate with all respect, because we also knew there was a meeting, or there was going to be a meeting. When I gave my evidence to you, I couldn't remember the timeline. I think perhaps the meeting had already taken place by the time we met the Minister at the end of June, beginning of July. So, we felt there was clearly something happening, something going on. We didn't have all the facts and figures. We also asked the department, were they at the meeting? From memory, and again from memory, I think they were, but they didn't want to come out up front and say, yes, we were there and everything was fine.
Yes, I think the committee knows there was a meeting attended by some politicians, by some departmental officials, by Red Sky.
Well, that concerned us even more, knowing that was the case.
And the Housing Executive wasn't invited to that meeting?
No, but we were asked to do a briefing for it. My understanding was we were asked to provide some information on the contract, the size of the contract, when did it start, when would it finish, etc., etc., etc.
Nor was the administrator at that meeting. Was that your understanding?
That's right, the administrator was not at that. And again, that concerned us, and I think this is laid out in Mr Roundtree's letter.
Yeah. So when at these meetings at the end of June, you dared to raise concerns about the Minister meddling in public procurement, you got a pretty rash and robust response, particularly from the Special Advisor, is that right?
Yes. Yes, we did.
Yes.
Yeah. In terms of, sorry, are you saying that we got a response from the Special Advisor?
Yes, the Special Advisor responded quite angrily.
We
I
did,
think.
absolutely. Yes, very, very. That was where I was accused of making an allegation. And I said, no, it's a question. And then again, no. And in fact, the Permanent Secretary was at that stage, was at the meeting, because he stepped in to try and cool things down.
So you say in your evidence, I was extremely concerned the Minister was getting involved not only in a NIHE operational matter, but one relating to a specific contract and a particular contractor. This could readily be perceived as a Minister lobbying for that contractor and also directly influencing or compromising a public procurement process. Was that your perception of what was going on?
Absolutely.
That the Minister was lobbying for a particular contractor?
My perception was there was a danger that that would be how it would be perceived. And as you know, perception... now, I mean, I don't know what was motivating the Minister. Therefore, I cannot say... all I can say is it seemed to me he was lobbying and making a very forceful case for us to extend the contract. And that is vindicated by the fact I asked for it to be put in writing. And in fact, we got in writing his request.
Were you aware there was a threat to use an Article 10 ministerial direction to the board?
There was. We thought that might happen.
Yes. And the Housing Executive, we know from the papers, indicated very robustly that if that were to happen, you'd be going to the High Court.
Absolutely. The reason we did that, I mean, and again, it's to explain to the members that we saw this as an extremely serious matter. We could not understand how we had arrived at a situation where a minister was writing to us. I mean, I was absolutely astonished when we received the letter. I would have thought when I had asked at the meeting for this to be put in writing, that would put it to bed. We would never see anything in writing. That the civil service would say to the minister, stand back, you're in a very, very difficult situation here. Don't go beyond the Rubicon here in this particular issue. And yet we receive a letter asking us to extend the contract.
Was that him going beyond the Rubicon?
Well, in my view it is. In my view, any of my staff, or indeed if I had done that, I would have been going beyond the Rubicon, absolutely.
Was that the Minister abusing his position?
Well, my view is that, and I've said there is a potential that he was in breach of his code. And I've looked at the code, and I know what the code says.
That was all focused on the meeting that was coming up with the board on the 5th of July. Were you aware of any lobbying that had been going on of board members?
I'm aware, of course, of the Jenny Palmer issue. I'm trying to remember, was that the 5th of...
July?
Yes, that was the first meeting. Yes, that was the meeting when the decision was made.
When the decision was made to reaffirm the concluding the contract on the 14th of July. Yeah.
Yes.
Could I take you back a bit? In February, and then I think it was in April, on the 4th and the 6th of February, it's at 5 of your evidence.
Mm-hmm.
There were meetings with Red Sky to discuss the issue of overpayment.
Yes.
And the third paragraph there says, it was clear that Red Sky did not get the message,
Yes.
or more likely were not prepared to accept it, and terminated the meeting.
Yes.
That obviously was another robust occasion.
Very difficult meeting.
Yes.
Very, very difficult meeting.
To the point where Red Sky terminated the meeting.
Yes, because...
And if I understand correctly, what you were looking for at that meeting was for Red Sky to respond
right.
in a time frame
Absolutely.
to the report, the
Or two
outcome of
reports,
which, outcomes of which you had provided to them.
Yes. Yes.
And Red Sky,
Are we leading witnesses here, or what means? Very unusual line of questioning.
I'm sure the chairman will side with it.
I'm sure he might,
I mean,
depending on who's asking.
I'm keeping an eye on this. I'm keeping an eye on where we're going with this. So,
No.
I mean, sorry, and we are dealing specifically with the submission from your colleague.
Yes. So when you say it was clear that Red Sky didn't get the message, or more likely, not prepared to accept it, that suggests to me a company that was used to getting its own way with the housing executive. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was, and I refer, there was a culture of Egan contracts, and there was this idea that Egan was all about partnership. And partnership is one aspect of it. But the key issue of any contract is the contract. And he, you know, who pays the fiddler, plays the tune. And really, we're reaching a situation where under Egan, some of the contractors, and in fact, not only Red Sky, there would be other contractors as well, would think that in fact every decision that was made had to be made in partnership with them. And to some extent, that maybe had been happening over a number of years. And I had come in with a very clear remit from the board and the chairman, look, we need to nip this in the bud. I think there was a gateway review on around about the same time. The gateway review was also making this point, look, you know, partnership is good, but at the end of the day, you pay for the contract, you determine what you have to get from it. And I was trying to get that message across to Red Sky in light of a very, very damning report.
But back in 2006, 2007, there'd been an attempt to terminate a Red Sky contract, isn't that right?
I understand, so only in retrospect I recall that.
And the housing executive backed down.
My understanding, and this never went to the board,
Yes.
this was never at the board, and senior managers of the team were unaware of this. And I think I say in my evidence that I believe it was the chief executive and the director of housing who dealt with that issue at that time. My understanding was that they were about to terminate the contract. There was a new chairman of Red Sky at that time. I think there were meetings, and there were probably assurances given at those meetings that the contractor would step up and would address concerns. And I would imagine, again, on that basis, that the contract was not terminated.
And the meeting with the chairman, that was with Mr. Cushnan,
That would have been Mr. Cushnan at that stage.
who had previously been a housing executive board member, a member of the audit committee,
That's right.
and who was subsequently criticised by the Public Accounts Committee for his involvement in that matter.
I'm unaware that he was criticised by the Public Accounts Committee. But, yeah.
Was there political lobbying at that time in support of Red Sky, or do you know that?
Totally unaware of that. I, like a number of other senior officers, were unaware of the discussion with Red Sky and Mr. Cushnan. We knew nothing about it. I knew nothing about it. It was only several years later, I think it came out as part of an audit report or into Red Sky that we became aware of this.
I was on the theme of Red Sky being a company give appearance of been used getting its own way with the housing executive.
Yeah, but I'm just minded that we're characterising beliefs, perceptions, and some may well share that, but just the fact of the matter is, on record, is that a number of contracts were and overcharging allegations or realities were negotiated down year on year. We dealt with this last week, so just asking people to be mindful about limiting the kind of characterisation of some that appreciate we're in sensitive territory, so I'm just asking people to be a bit mindful about the characteristics.
Could I ask it this way? Was there an occasion when Red Sky, having protested about the attitude of a staff member in a part of Belfast, that staff member was then removed from his post?
I understand that is the case, yeah.
And that was someone who was trying to be a whistleblower, is that right?
My understanding is that's correct. And in fact, during my 9 months, I had to deal with a request from that particular officer, and the only way I could deal with that request was to offer him his post back where he had been. He was very, very annoyed at what had happened, that he had been moved out of his role as I think, district maintenance officer. He felt he had been doing an extremely good job. I must say, when I came into the post and was presented with what was the evidence, I felt he had been trying to do a good job as well. And I was very, very concerned that, in fact, he had been transferred and moved out. And I felt it was a matter of justice and fairness to an employee. And I said to him, you can have your post back, the vacancy will be coming up, will you accept it? And I think he eventually, I think he wanted to wait until the Red Sky issue had been resolved.
Yeah.
And I think from memory he may have gone back to that post.
But he'd been removed from that post at a time when Red Sky had asked for him to be removed.
Well, I think, I mean, at that time, again, I need to stress, I was not the chief executive, acting chief executive. In fact, I had very little involvement with maintenance. The director of housing would have been involved with the maintenance issue. I am aware that their view would be there was a rotation policy and that this officer was moved as part of the rotation policy.
Was it any of their business what staff were in charge, placed where by housing executive?
Sorry, whose business?
Red Skies.
Well, again, it does go back to this idea, and you know, there was this culture amongst housing executive, senior management, and contractors that this was a partnership. And you know, I think there's now a recognition that you know there's partnerships and partnerships. Partnerships don't mean that every decision that is made you consult and the contractor has to agree. I mean, that was one of the things I was trying to get across to Red Sky at the robust meeting we had, that, you know, things have moved on and that, you know, we now were asking for certain things to happen, and if they didn't happen, there would be consequences.
Okay, I mean, bring members back in again. So, Dolores.
Thank you, Chair.
Then Sammy, then Stuart, then Gregory.
Mr. Cuddy, thank you for your briefing. It's been very helpful, and I have to say I do admire the candid nature in which you are attempting to answer the questions. Can I ask, at any of the meetings that you had with the Minister and his SPAD, whether or not any of them ever raised their concerns about the allegations of overcharging and poor workmanship? Was that ever a feature?
I think it was a feature of the overall maintenance programme that, you know, if it was applicable to Red Sky, presumably it was applicable or could potentially be applicable to other contractors. And our view at that stage was, look, we do have an in-house audit team, review team, and it does throw up, for every contractor, it throws up issues. And we try and resolve those issues. But this one was, in our estimation, as validated by the report, the external forensic report, was much, much, much more serious. And I was trying to recollect why we had commissioned the Red Sky, that report on the Red Sky, and it went back to an audit committee meeting. And the chair of the audit committee meeting had felt that the issue of Red Sky, and she had been there on our board for quite a number of years, it had been a recurring issue. And she just felt there was, I think, a whistleblowing letter, or there was a letter.
Yes, that's right.
And she said, look, we need to do something about this. And on the basis of that, the forensic accountant's report was commissioned. And on the basis of what was an independent report, I mean, one has to act on the facts and the evidence presented.
Is it what I'm struggling to understand? If I was responsible for a department and this evidence was brought to me by people who are in good standing, that I was more concerned about Red Sky, if you like, the perpetrators of the overcharging and the poor workmanship, rather than the public interest. I just find that hard to understand.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, again, I think I said earlier, we could not understand why the minister was getting involved in something like this, and that is why we reacted so strongly in terms of both at the meeting at the end of June, beginning of July, and then in terms of the letter that the chairman sent, and then the following letter, which was a very legalistic letter in terms of we were fearful that we were going to get a direction. And we had tried to diffuse that by the letter of the 1st of July, which was to the Permanent Secretary. But in fact, nothing seemed to have happened. We got a letter dated the 1st of July making a request. So we felt that if there was a direction, we had to get the ducks in a row to deal with that.
Thank you. Then on the first, or the letter of the 31st of August from the Permanent Secretary to Brian Rowntree, it's at page 109 and section 10. But it's just in the second paragraph, it strikes me that in response to the concerns expressed to the Permanent Secretary about his role in acting as a buffer, if you like, between the Housing Executive and the Minister and concerns around public interest, in his answer, he says that he at all times, in his role as accounting officer, is to act within the authority of the Minister to whom I am responsible and to support the Minister with clear, well-reasoned, timely and impartial advice. It is, however, ultimately the Minister's decision to accept or reject that advice. But that's nearly as far as he seems to understand his role, which runs contrary to what I would have understood, and certainly what you outlined yourself, Mr Cuddy, that he had a clear role to take that up the line within the civil service.
Well, I'm assuming he would. I don't know the detailed protocols pertaining to that level of the civil service, but I would have thought in terms of what they call overall governance, there's bound to be very clear advice, and there's bound to have been precedents where ministers come in and they've got very clear views. I'm not really talking about Northern Ireland, I'm talking about across the UK. So these cases have happened before, where a minister comes in, wants to do something, and the Permanent Secretary says, "Well, I'm sorry, you're going too far here, and I'm going to have to protect myself by putting this to you in writing." And in fact, it's now so serious that in fact I'm directing it up the line. And I think from memory, somebody told me many years ago, there is a policy that takes it up to the head of the civil service. And from there, presumably, it can go into whatever level it needs to go to.
But Mr Hare certainly didn't suggest that he would be taking any such course of action in that letter, and in fact goes on to, if you like, rebut or put Brian Rowntree on notice, should he almost persist. I think, Chair, I would like some clarification as to the function, and I'm sure it's something we'll pick up with Mr Hare at a later stage. It's just one further question. I'm just trying to see now, there was a meeting between the Minister, DSD and Red Sky, and I think yourselves, but just wondered who requested the meeting. Just trying to see the date of it.
Sorry, a meeting
in April 2011. You and the Chair of the Housing Executive met with senior DUP representatives, including Minister McCausland and Peter Robinson, to discuss the termination
That's right.
the Red Sky contract. Can you advise us what you understood to be the purpose of this meeting, and can we ask who requested this meeting?
I think the purpose of the meeting was we had been advised there were very serious concerns by elected representatives about the decision or the imminent decision to terminate a contract. And obviously there were employment issues there as well, in terms of the company operated out of East Belfast, employed 300 to 400 staff, and therefore we assumed that was the main reason for the meeting. I cannot recall, I think it was one of the three elected representatives asked for it.
I think it was at that. I think it was Mr. Robin Newton.
I think it was Mr. Newton asked for the meeting, and as it turned out at the meeting, there were. That was one concern, and
I think our advice would be that the Minister was not at that particular meeting, so just wanted to make that.
All right, okay.
No, the Minister was not at that meeting.
No.
He wasn't the Minister then.
Was he?
No, he wasn't. It was Alex Atwood was the then Minister. Yeah, I think.
Right. Okay.
But I don't think Alex.
No,
was
there was no Minister at the meeting, and there were a number of concerns. That was one of them, and we tried to reassure that under Chubby, the employment issue would be mitigated to some extent, not maybe 100%, but at least there wouldn't be as many jobs lost if we proceeded down that line. And as I know, they felt there was a sectarian element to the decision, and again, we said, look, there's no way that was an issue at all. And we pointed out the background of board members from all communities. And the final one, which again we had never thought about, because it had never been an issue, was a suggestion that we timed this as part of the PERDA. And again, that was the first time that had been raised with us, and clearly no intention whatsoever. I mean, if that had been an issue, we would have raised it as an issue, but it happened, and the time frame it happened, without any reference to elections or anything else. And I think, you know, in balance, I think they were reasonably reassured at what we said.
Although I believe, Chair, at that meeting, it was Mr Robinson put on notice the fact that any incoming minister would actually widen the net in terms of investigations around particular contractors. It seemed to have been quite a, I mean, on the reading of it was quite a robust meeting, and I would have thought threatening at times for officials.
My memory of the meeting was that it was a reasonably difficult meeting, but I felt that at the end of the day, when we explained to the elected representatives a rationale, what had happened, I got the impression that, it's maybe not 100% satisfied, they could understand where we were coming from.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
All right, okay, and I'll come back with Stephanie or Sammy.
Okay, Mr. Colley, maybe you could explain to us your role in supervising, knowing about, receiving information about these contracts, both before you became Chief Executive and then during your period of Chief Executive?
I think that will be helpful to explain that, particularly from my point of view. I was appointed as the Director of Corporate Service, Deputy Chief Executive of the Housing Executive, and it was quite a difficult relationship with myself and the Chief Executive, because as the Deputy Chief Executive, I felt I had a role which was a deputy, whereas the Chief Executive felt I deputised for him when he wasn't there, if he so requested. So there was always a tension between myself and the Chief Executive. That isn't to say that we didn't. We still worked, and we got on and worked effectively. However, the maintenance contracts were the responsibility of the Director of Housing and Regeneration, Mr Colin McCallie, at that time. Therefore, most issues he would have dealt with, and the only issues that would have bubbled up to the top, which would have come through the management team, would have been very difficult issues that had not been resolved or required a resolution, and which the Chief Executive decided needed to be on the agenda, or which was brought to the meeting by the Director of Housing and Regeneration. So in many ways, I had virtually no input at all to contracts, except if something came up at the management team meeting, and I felt I had a contribution to make, either in terms of being constructive in my criticism or maybe supporting what was being done, then I would do it.
So you tell me that during all that time, and despite the allegations that finally came to the surface that there had been overcharging, that there was bad supervision of these contracts, bad delivery of these contracts, especially in certain areas, letters presumably went to the Chief Executive's office. You're saying you knew nothing about any of this during all that time?
What I'm saying is the only time this became a major issue that merited the type of investigation that eventually happened was when this issue went to the Audit Committee. And indeed, not only...
When was that?
That would have been just before we commissioned the Forensic Accounts report, which I would have thought would have been around about 2010. I'm not too sure what the time frame is between the two. But, you know, again, that's not surprising, because we had a very, very active audit committee. On that audit committee were representatives from the department. On that committee were the Northern Ireland Audit Office. On that committee were all the directors who attended. We were all there, and none of us except presumably the Chief Executive possibly and the Director of Housing and Regeneration would have known where their major issues, and I don't know if they knew at all. I assumed that the contracts were being operated satisfactorily. We had an in-house review team that produced reports, management reports, that went to the Director of Housing. Those went into the Audit Committee. Everything seemed to, by and large, seemed to be okay. Occasionally you would have got an adverse report. Action would have been taken and reported back to the Audit Committee.
So, for years, or certainly for a long period of time, there were complaints about this coming from ground level. People were being, according to what you're saying, being removed from their job because of the actions of a particular contract. Overcharging was occurring. Poor delivery was occurring. And because of the culture of secrecy or division within the housing executive, the silo mentality, all of this went under the radar from senior management. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that there was one member of staff transferred. Okay, so I'm trying to put this in context. There wasn't as if there were 10 or 15 staff moved that everybody, this became an issue. I mean, I was unaware of that person being moved until afterwards, when it became an issue, because it was deemed to be an ongoing management issue. I would be an operational matter I was unaware of. The questions about poor delivery and overcharging, again, those would have been going through a number of contracts. And what happened was, once there was overcharging found, whether it was intentional, but in most cases it was deemed not to be intentional, an adjustment was made to the next payment to deal with that. So all of these things were seemed to be managed. Complaints. The only complaint I was aware of that bubbled up to senior level, and that's not to say there were others that didn't bubble up and may have been kept secret, I don't know, was the whistleblower, and it came to the Audit Committee. And being a member of that Audit Committee, I was very, very well aware of that particular complaint and very, very well aware of the Audit Committee reaction.
Right, so I'm trying to just get the picture, because this I think is very important when we come to look at the reaction of the Housing Executive to any investigation into the way they behaved. We've got this picture that for a long time this went on, senior management were kept unaware of it. When they did become aware of it...
I'm not saying senior management comprises the Chief Executive, the Director of Housing and Client Services, Director of Corporate Services, which was myself. There was a Director of Consultancy Services, Director of Personnel, Director of Finance. I have no doubt that the Director of Housing and Regeneration was the title, and probably the Chief Executive. If there were issues, they would have been aware of them. I have no doubt they would have been. But I'm unaware that there were issues.
But never, well, there clearly were issues, because you've told us that there were issues, and we've had them all well documented to us. But the Housing Executive allowed this to trundle on for some time, to the point of view where people were paid for work that didn't do it, etc. Now, would you accept that there must have been a certain amount, as much as a Housing Executive can be embarrassed by anything, a certain amount of embarrassment within the senior management team of the Housing Executive at the debacle that they had overseen?
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, and this is where I think the difficulty from my point of view comes in. You're a minister as well, up until the election in 2011, who either was unaware of this, or because of the way he was disposed towards the Housing Executive, was quite happy for the Housing Executive to trundle on and do this. Was the minister, as far as you're aware, the previous minister, aware of any of this, given that the Audit Committee had identified it in 2010? Was he aware of this at any time before he left his post in 2011?
My memory is yes, he was, because we did meet with the former minister. I can't remember the exact time frame, but it would have been either just before he left. I'm trying to remember whether that coincided with this report. I would need to look at the time frames, whether the report came out at that stage during his tenure I think that report maybe came out during the previous minister's tenure, and he left and then the new minister came in. But yes, there definitely was a meeting. And in fact, I remember at least one meeting, the minister wanted us to terminate the contract. And we said, well, you cannot terminate a contract unilaterally without evidence, without information to support that action.
And tell me this, did you write the same kind of letters to the previous minister? You've talked here about your disgust and your alarm at the interference which Nelson McCausland wished to exercise in respect of this contract. Was the same kind of message conveyed to the previous minister?
No, because, and the reason was, at those meetings, both the Permanent Secretary and or the Deputy Secretary, Barney McGachan, and the reason I remember this is Barney was a colleague of mine in the Health Service, so I'd known him from that background. They attended those meetings, and when we put to them the situation that you cannot willy-nilly terminate contracts, they understood that, and they, I think, were able to get the minister to understand that you know, there are certain steps you have to take to terminate a contract. Otherwise, we would left the organisation vulnerable in terms of the legal process.
But nevertheless, the previous minister, because I want to get to one of your central points. The previous minister did not see any curtailment on him in questioning public sector contracts, in asking you to terminate a public sector contract, in making representations about a public sector contract. Is that right?
All I can say is the minister was keen that we would terminate the contract because I can't remember whether the report was out at that stage or not, but yes, he wanted us to terminate the contract.
Now, you see, this is where I have a difficulty with you, Mr. Cuddy, and with the balance of your evidence. Because this is what you said. You were concerned that any public representative would even think about interfering in a public sector contract. Yet you're saying that the previous minister thought it was okay. His permanent secretary was attending some meetings.
So there was a difference, Mr. Wilson. The difference was, at those meetings, the civil servants at a senior level who accompanied the minister were re-echoing to the minister the advice that we were giving. Now, we could understand a minister, any minister, where there's bad press around a contract, coming in and saying, for goodness sake, what are you doing? You're going to terminate and get this sorted out. I want this contract terminated. We put the view logically to him that there were certain steps we had to take. Those views, from recollection, were re-echoed, both at the meeting, maybe not in a very strong way at the meeting, but we knew we had the senior civil servants on board. And indeed, if we'd been getting that sort of feedback from the meetings with the other minister, this issue would not have escalated.
Well, we'll come to whether there's a difference in one situation and another. But I take it you're now clarifying your earlier remarks, where you seem to be indicating that in fact, there was something suspicious and certainly something unsavoury about any minister daring to query a public sector contract. You're saying now that, well, you would qualify that, and of course there'll be grounds when a minister may well ask officials about a public sector contract.
No. What I'm saying is, I'm saying I can understand a minister getting very uptight about contracts within an organisation that he has overall responsibility and oversight for, right? And we can understand him at times being very, very upset and suggesting and indicating the contract should be terminated. But it's a different matter. It's a different matter when it's clear that, you know, advice and our advice is not being accepted. That, you know, when we're saying, look, this contract, the performance has been poor, we've got a very damning report, therefore, you know, our view is that you should not get involved in this. This contract needs to be terminated going through the process, and you should stand back from that. And we were being told notwithstanding that, we want this contract extended.
Well,
So I think the two situations were different. But I'm not saying I can understand a minister coming in and his first reaction being, I want this contract terminated. A minister does not spend 20, 30 years in the public sector and necessarily understand all the protocols. But when he's told something from his senior managers, and presumably told something, again, I'm assuming told so the same by the Permanent Secretary and senior civil servants, and doesn't accept that, then I think there is a major concern.
so
Tommy, could we ask the question, because it may be helpful, was there any subsequent intervention by that particular minister after? Because I think that helps us to the response. Okay.
So you're saying that it wouldn't be unusual for a minister to ask about a public sector contract. It certainly wouldn't be unusual for him to receive representations from other MLAs who had concerns raised with them about a public sector contract. That's the normal part of a minister's job, and it would be the normal part of a public representative's job if concerns were drawn to their attention.
Well, from my perspective, and maybe I come with more information having spent so long in the public sector, but if I was an advisor to a minister, my advice to him was, whether it was a civil service advisor or a special advisor, is you should not meet contractors where there's been a damning report of their work to meet you, in case that is misrepresented as lobbying, and the perception, whether they're lobbying or not, is that they will be lobbying. My clear advice would be, don't go near it.
No, that wasn't the question I asked you, Mr. Cuddy. The question I asked you was, because you made a very definite statement to this committee that you would have been concerned about any representations that a minister would have taken about a public sector contract. Now, you're now qualifying that and saying that if other MLAs asked to speak to him about it, about concerns, that's part of a minister's job. If concerns about a contract were drawn to a minister's attention and he asked questions about it, that's part of a minister's job as well, and that there would be nothing unusual in him asking officials and talking to officials about the contract.
I agree with that. However, there's a process here. The process is, as you very well know, a minister asks a question about a contract, about anything, which he's obviously entitled to do. And during that process, which may be one meeting, where we're at a meeting, and we provide a response, and we tell him what the position is, and yet still that minister then appears to insist to go down a road, that to me is unacceptable.
Well, let me come to the next part.
In terms of public
Let me come to the next
procurement.
thing, because it is quite clear why the minister was concerned. And I note that you said, again, maybe you want to qualify this, just the way you've now qualified your bold statement.
Well, I don't know if I've qualified. I hope I've explained it with all respect.
Well, you did make a bold statement, which has now been considerably modified as a result of the answers you've given. The second thing he said was this, that you did not know why the minister had raised concerns about the termination of the contract. Is that right?
Are we talking now about Minister McCausland?
Yes, Minister McCausland.
Mr. McCausland. I raised concerns at the meeting. I asked why he was so interested in Red Sky in the context of the minister wanting the contract extended,
Yes.
because it seemed totally illogical that if you have a damning report on a contractor, why would you ask for the contract to be extended?
But this is what you said, and maybe you want to think about this one as well. Again, you didn't know why he would want the contract extended.
No.
You didn't.
Didn't know.
Did you see the letter that he sent to Mr. Roundtree on the 1st of July?
I did.
Maybe you'd like to just... it's in the pack that's been handed to you, and it's on tab 10. and it's on page, well, it's the third page in, just on the big
Is
folder.
it the short letter here?
The short letter.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Now, let's just look at that letter. You say you had read it.
Yes.
There are a number of points he makes in it. At the end of the first paragraph, he asked for a forensic investigation, including those contractors whom it is proposed to reassign Red Sky contracts on termination. Why would you have asked that question?
Well, I'm assuming he would have asked that question for a number of reasons. One, were there problems with those particular contractors, right? That would be one reason, presumably.
Yes.
As a comparison with Red Sky.
And had he already asked officials that question previously?
The question about problems with other contractors?
Yes.
I'm sure he would have raised that with, he may have asked...
Did he ever raise it with you?
At the meeting, he would have asked about the performance of other contractors.
Right. So he had raised it with you. And had you been able to give him any assurance about the performance of other contractors?
I remember one particular question, and I responded by saying, I have one query on my desk at the moment with a particular contractor. I was able to, because it was a quite an unusual query, I don't want to name the contractor at the moment.
They were named in the documentation anyway, and you knew the name of the contractor at that stage. Go ahead.
Yeah. But I said, yes, I have an invoice query on my desk at the moment. But I made the point, I did not believe it was material in terms of the wider cost of the contract.
And yet, within 9 months of this, housing executive officials were informing the minister that this was not confined to Red Sky. This applied to all of the companies to the tune of 18 million.
Sorry, sorry, I have to intervene here because...
I think there are two
Sammy,
different
sorry,
contracts here.
I'm going to make a point, I'm going to make a ruling. This is two separate contracts entirely.
Yeah.
Two separate contracts entirely, Sammy. They are, and
Chairman.
sorry, I'm going to have to say to you, we're not dealing with that set of contract because that was the response, that it was the planned maintenance contracts entirely separate. We've been dealing with that, so that is not relevant to this particular.
No, the point of the
And you
point
can't
I'm
make,
making,
sorry, you
I know that there were
cannot,
two
sorry,
separate
Sammy,
contracts.
I'm making a ruling on this. You can't make that suggestion because it's factually incorrect.
I know there were
entirely separate matter.
No, I know there were two separate contracts, but what I'm trying to illustrate.
I know the
is
very
that
point you're
there
making.
is there was a culture.
Sorry, I'm directing the meeting, so you'll not deal with that and you'll not respond to that particular question because it's not relevant.
Well,
It's erroneous.
Would you accept then that the minister was increasingly aware of a culture of slack management within the housing executive, where the potential for overpayments could extend to more than just one company?
I think he had a concern. There was a start of a concern at that stage. I don't think prior to that, now of course he mightn't have been in office that long anyway, but yes, clearly he had raised concerns that if it happened with Red Sky, then it could be with other contractors. Our problem was, look, yes, that may be the case, as it turned out, it was the case. But you know, two wrongs don't make a right. We were quite happy to say, yes, we will look, and if those contracts, or if they're overpayments and overcharging, we'll deal with those as well.
Yep. So, first of all, the minister would have been concerned that it was a case of assigning contracts to somebody who may have been guilty of even more than Red Sky.
But there was no evidence of all respect at that. I mean, the other view could be this is a fishing exercise.
Well,
we had no evidence on those other contracts.
But you did, because there were allegations made, and in fact you've already told me you had one piece of paper on your desk about another contractor.
But with all respect, I also made the point to the minister when he pushed me on that. It was a one-off incident at that stage, and I used the word material, and he asked me what did I mean by material, and I suppose I was using an accounting term that in the overall size of the contract, I think the invoice at that time was maybe £400 or £500. I can't remember, for a piece of work that it was not a material consideration, but it was still being addressed. So the point I was trying to make is, one query on one piece of work would not be a reason to then start a full-scale investigation.
But Mr. Cuddick, I know you're trying to underplay this because this is a significant point. The fact is that before the 1st of July, the Housing Executive were aware that there were other potential overpayments to contractors, some of whom may have been assigned the work that was going to Red Sky. So you say you didn't know why the Minister wanted this terminated, or wanted you to consider this. There's one reason, and he'd given you that reason, that you could be assigning work to firms which might be guilty of even more than Red Sky.
But with respect, I said to the members earlier, there is an in-house, in the Housing Executive, review team. That review team looks at samples of work for all the contractors. And what it does is you find examples of poor workmanship in isolated cases. You also find examples of overcharging and indeed sometimes undercharging. And what happens is there's an ongoing monthly adjustment to the contract to reflect that. And that would have applied for years to a number of contracts. The problem was the Red Sky was on the Richter scale. It stood out because of the scale of this. And the scale of it was identified through the forensic report. We are aware there were overpayments and underpayments.
And subsequently, the scale was off the Richter scale with some of the other ones as well. And the second point, and just read the second paragraph of the letter. To reassign the contracts in this way would have required that you didn't go out to tender, isn't that correct? To reassign the contracts quickly.
Within the terms of, from memory, within the terms of those contracts, we are obliged to reassign the work to adjacent contractors. I think there is a contractual responsibility that they, because they've already tendered and gone through the process, that if a contractor, for whatever reason, pulls out or a contract is terminated, that contract is reallocated to adjacent contractors.
Right.
And that precludes, as you say, the need at that stage to go out for competitive tendering.
So when you said you didn't know why the Minister wanted you to consider extending the contract, really you're not correct, because you've read the letter and you've identified the two reasons in the letter. That first of all, the work might have been reassigned to people who were as guilty, if not more guilty, than what had been alleged in Red Sky, and secondly, there wouldn't have even been a tender process.
But with all respect, if you went out to a competitive tendering process and brought in new contractors, there's always a potential. There's always a potential for it to be overcharging. How do I prove something that I don't know is out there?
But why do you tender at all then?
Well, what I'm saying to you with all respect is, why would we assume that there are massive overcharging with adjacent contractors at that stage, and there wasn't no evidence of that at that stage? Why would we want to do that and go out to a competitive tendering exercise and probably end up in the same situation?
Because at this stage you already had allegations, and you already were looking at another company where you had crazy out invoices. But I mean, I've got to say, Mr. Cully, I mean, I hope you're not making an argument for you don't go open tender, you don't go competitive tender, because the argument you're making there, take it to its conclusion, is you wouldn't go out to tender anyway.
Not at all.
You've got 5 contractors.
Sorry, Tommy, let him finish. I know, but let him finish the answer. And you could have all the kind of word here. We're here all day to ask the question you need
to reassign the contracts is part of the normal tendering process and contract management, and it is written into the contracts, and it's done for a number of reasons. Particularly if you've got contractors who already are doing the work and have the capacity, you can get them to do it at the rates that they tendered for, and there's very, very pragmatic and practical reasons for doing that. But in terms of competitive tendering, absolutely, I'm 100% behind competitive tendering.
But not if there is a cloud of suspicion hanging over those contractors, which the housing executive, and don't forget, it wasn't too long after this before you asked Harth to conduct an investigation into the rest of the contractors and found that there was the same degree of overcharging. So, you know,
well, I don't know if there was the same degree of overcharging. Those reports were not out by the time I left. I have no idea what they found. I'm sure they found some level of overcharging. Whether it was the same degree...
£3,000.
Sorry?
I heard it last week, £3,000.
Yeah.
Whether it was the same degree, I don't know.
But there was a cloud of suspicion. Hence,
No, I think with all respect,
Sorry, Tommy, that's Stuart.
you are making this out to be a much greater issue than it was.
Mr. Cuddy, just a wee second, please. I've asked early on there to people just to be very mindful how they're characterising their remarks. Let's stick to the facts that we know and probe the questions that we want answered. Let's try and do it in as professional a way as possible. So people we can be here as long as we need to be here to ask whatever questions we want relevant to the issue. So no panic, no rush. Let people ask the questions, let people answer the question.
it wasn't only, of course, the Minister who came in for the ire of the Housing Executive on this. It was also the Permanent Secretary. Is that correct? Because he dared to give advice.
Again, I'm advising on the use of language here and characterisation of relationships.
I must say, now, my recollection of the situation was, my concern was that the civil service, senior civil servants, including the Permanent Secretary, could have moved to diffuse this situation. We were very, very concerned. I mean, the one thing I've said in my written evidence that I was pains to point out the role of the Permanent Secretary as Senior Accounting Officer and advice to the Minister, and that we felt what was going on. Now, having said that, perhaps the Permanent Secretary had given that advice, either orally in writing, but he never, and maybe he didn't share that with us. Now, a telephone call, maybe to clarify issues, may have helped. But the letter we wrote on the 1st of July was a genuine attempt to try and diffuse this situation. And the words in that letter was, we're asking you to step back. Now, we didn't write, the Chairman didn't then have the next letter, which was the very legalistic letter, which followed that, threatening to take this to the High Court. That letter would not have been written if the first letter on the 1st of July, if the Minister and the Permanent Secretary had acted on that.
Yeah, but the Permanent Secretary is accounting officer. And see, this is the point I'm getting to. The Permanent Secretary is the accounting officer.
Yeah.
Felt that the Housing Executive were being overly defensive and, first of all, using kind of incendiary language such as we don't like the road you're pushing us down, and questioning, he believed you were questioning his integrity in that respect, and was going to seek legal advice on the matter. So the Housing Executive didn't only take objection, you've expressed it, didn't only take objection to the Minister querying what they were doing and asking for a forensic examination of the other contract, but they also took exception to the accounting officer in the department.
With all respect, it was not about taking exception. We felt we were being confronted.
Well, he felt you were.
We were confronted with a major organisational issue, and we couldn't understand how something like this could come about. There is no question of us taking umbrage to anything. I'm very, very well aware in big public sector organisations, many things can go wrong, and the one thing you learn is to be humble because you don't know what could be underneath. So our concern was something's going to happen out of this. We want to stop it, something that won't be very good for the Housing Executive, for the Department, and indeed for the public, the wider public. We tried genuinely to diffuse that situation. Now, the letter was a robust letter, but we felt that that was required under the circumstances.
But you can see that the other interpretation, Mr. Cuddy, is that the Housing Executive, having made a mess of this, having, because of its culture of silo, dealing with these in silos, not being aware of, didn't really want any scrutiny from the Minister or from the Permanent Secretary and took exception to both.
Well, that may be an interpretation. I can assure you, from my point of view, that was far, far from my motivation.
But even your evidence here this morning, where you have queried the right of the Minister to have asked robust questions about the contract,
I don't think that's fair.
Well, I've just quoted
I
on
don't think it's
a number
fair,
of
Tommy,
occasions.
because Mr. Cuddy...
Misquoted more like.
All right, well, let's keep one at a time. Mr. Cuddy's made it very clear he accepted and acknowledged the right of representatives, including the Minister, to ask questions. The point was made by Mr. Cuddy when advised that then people were going beyond where they should do. That's where we get into muddy territory, and that's what we have to deal with. So Mr. Cuddy had no point says.
Well, all I would say is...
So just don't be unfairly for the record, misrepresenting.
I was glad that during questioning he did actually clarify some of that and you know, maybe mollify some of his language from earlier on. But, you know, I suppose the first answer that he gave to Mr. Allister indicates the kind of mindset that there was within the Housing Executive. The fairly terse letter or angry letter from the Housing Executive to the Permanent Secretary, which drew the angry response, was an indication as well that the Housing Executive didn't like investigation of this. And I would suggest to you, Mr. Cuddy,
just tell me, you know, you're experienced enough to realise, listen, there's a certain amount of cut and thrust, and people will use a certain amount of colourful language. I'll give as much latitude as possible, but you know, we really need to stop mischaracterising things.
I just want to ask one last question. Given that the Minister was aware that he didn't have it quantified and he asked for you to quantify it, given that he was aware of other allegations of overcharging, given his concern that a single tender action might actually benefit those who may have been overcharging, and given that the people who were being complained about, i.e. Red Sky staff, because don't forget it wasn't just about overcharging, it was about the quality of workmanship, were going to be tupied over to the firms which are going to be take on the new contract anyway. Would you not accept that he had reasonable grounds for asking for the contract to be extended to allow some brand new contractors to apply for the work?
If he had asked for the contracts to be retendered without extending Red Sky, we would have found that quite difficult, but we would have strived to achieve that. What we could not accept was extending the contract of a contractor who had been found to be overcharging and where the workmanship was very, very poor, and where the contractor, which we didn't say, had been referred to the PSNI on the basis of potential fraud.
But the alternative of not extending the contract was to run the risk of giving, for a period of time, contracts to firms about whom there was some doubt.
But there would be doubt, potential doubt, over a whole range of different contractors. I mean, how can you be sure? How do you prove that somebody is overcharging if you don't actually have the proof and the evidence there to support that?
Okay. You have to say that was your last question, so if you're happy enough for that, then we'll move on. Stuart.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Cuddy, for coming to us today and for the information which you've brought to us. Can I just look at the aspect in terms of your written submission, and indeed something that's followed up with in correspondence as well, where you say that such interventions, this is the Minister's intervention you've noted earlier, could readily be perceived as the Minister lobbying for a contractor and influencing the public procurement process, which is in flagrant breach of the public sector conduct and ethics and also a violation. Also, you go on to say, as far as I'm aware, no explanation has been received as to why the Minister wanted the Red Sky extended. So on the one hand, we have the Minister attempting to extend the Red Sky contract. On the other hand, in a letter to the Member of Parliament for the constituency of East Belfast on the 25th of May, he clearly outlined, made no reference to wishing to extend the contract, but rather he was entirely supportive of the position of the Housing Executive.
Absolutely.
Do you believe the Minister was trying to mislead the Member of Parliament for East Belfast when he didn't explain that he was trying to extend the contract, but rather that he was backing the Housing Executive's
Not at
position?
all. Not at all. We thought he was accepting the analysis that we had provided to the department to enable him to respond to that letter.
So you must have been then very surprised when he came back and said that that wasn't what he was going to do. What he wanted to do was to extend the contract.
Absolutely shocked. That's, I say that was why we were so taken aback.
Yeah. Why do you think he did that? I mean, why do you think, was this a change of mind, or was this actually some sort of deliberately not wanting the Member of Parliament to know what his real intent was?
It was a change of mind.
I think you need to be mindful that you're not interpreting anybody else's motivation.
No, I think the letter,
you know happened or didn't happen.
the letter to Naomi Long reflected the analysis as we felt, and he accepted that. And clearly his advisers, when we provided the evidence for him to respond to the letter, accepted that what we were saying was true and legitimate.
Mm-hmm. So why do you think the Minister then went on to change his mind and view on this matter?
Stuart, I'm just saying to Stuart, saying to yourself, I don't think Stuart Cuddy can actually interpret why someone changed their mind. It's not his job to do that. If you
Well,
know
he may not be able to interpret the mind. Can he point us to any evidence that demonstrates why the Minister would want to change his mind? Where were the influences coming from to want to change that view? Can you point us to any evidence as to why this change of mind took place?
Probably not.
That's fine. Thank you, Chair.
On the back of that, I mean, you have, Stuart, in your regulation on paragraph 2, 11, I guess there's 2 or 3 bullet points, and on the last one, you refer to administrators appeared not to be dealing expeditiously with the transfer of TUPE on the basis that there was some, he thought, it's inverted commas, or decision by the Minister to defer terminating the contract. I'm just trying to follow up on Stuart Dix's question there, because you're attributing that, I presume, to the administrators.
Yeah, we had a number of concerns with the administrators because clearly, you know, to protect the jobs, there had to be a fairly slick TUPE transfer, and we were putting a lot of resources into that because we had had representations from the various MLAs and the meeting, and we were keen that there would be no problems with the transfer. But what we were finding was, in fact, the administrators, despite the fact we were providing all the information, were very, very slow to deal with the TUPE issues. And then, in some of the correspondence, we were saying, you know, but why, I mean, you need to first of all confirm that this is not contrary to the decision taken by the Minister. Now, at that stage, there was no decision, as far as we knew, taken by the Minister. And we had concerns that perhaps there were other conversations going on that we were not party to.
Last week to see.
Okay. Stuart?
Chair, when they say decisions by the Minister to defer terminating the contract, how would the administrators be aware of those decisions? Where would they be getting that information from?
Well, again, that was why we felt maybe there were discussions, negotiations going on that we were not privy to. Somebody pointed out the fact we were not invited to the meeting with Red Sky, where the Minister met Red Sky. So again, I mean, in a situation like that, under a lot of pressure, trying to find out what's going on, you think of all possibilities.
But the Housing Executive hadn't shared the Minister's view or request to extend the contract with the administrators.
Well, I mean, there may have been some informal throwaway line, well, do you know the Minister wants us to? I mean, that could happen because a number of our staff, our purchasing officer, Declan, I'm trying to remember Declan's name, had corresponded.
I suppose this is a question really for the administrator, but bearing in mind that as professional administrators, they will understand the law with regards to TUPE and the overall duty of care to employees in terms of transferring them. It seems to be that if you're suggesting that they were trying to hold that back because there was something in the air about the Minister wanting to change his mind.
I think that's a fair assumption, and we would have assumed that as well. Yeah. And the other thing would have been. My understanding was that the administrators, when we asked them about being able to take on the contract for up to 6 months, whatever the period was, they came back and said, look, NewCo can do it on our behalf. Now, if NewCo had been doing it, that would have meant there would have been no treaty at that stage, no formal treaty, because my understanding was NewCo was going to be a reorganisation, the old company would be reconstituted, and therefore that process would probably be much easier to transfer those staff to the new company. So that may have been potentially their issue as well.
I think, Chair, these are perhaps more questions for the administrators to answer rather than the executive, but it has certainly opened an interesting window which we need to further explore with the administrators. Thank you.
Okay, sure, thanks for that. Okay, Gregory?
Yeah, Mr. Crowley, I wanted to ask you about, obviously the relevant period is the period before and then during 2011, during the discussions, the meetings and the contract award. In answer to a previous question, you were talking about the people whom you would have perceived to be the most senior people in the housing executive, each of the categories. Just so that I'm clear, you said obviously the Chief Executive, the Deputy Chief Executive, the Director of Corporate Services, was that right?
The Deputy Chief Executive and the Director of Corporate Services, when I was there, both posts, both titles were my post. When I was acting, Tarek Bailey, who was a finance officer, moved across to become the Director of Corporate Services, and John McPeak, who was the Director of Design and Consultancy Services, he took the title of Deputy Chief Executive. But John had been there a long time, with a lot of experience, which, with respect to Tarek, who just joined us from the Health Service, didn't have. So that was the rationale.
I understand that, but I want to go on now. Did you then describe as well the post of Director of Housing and Regeneration as being senior, right?
Absolutely.
So, if we're looking at the most senior people within the housing executive as an organisation, we're talking about, even though there may be a bit of overlap, we're talking about 4 positions: Chief Executive, Deputy Chief Executive, Director of Corporate Services and Director of Housing and Regeneration. Is that right? They would be, whoever's in those posts at the appropriate time would be the most senior people. Is that right?
I would also include the Director of Finance,
right,
who had been Tarek Bailey prior to him going across and acting as Director of Corporate Services. And the final person would have been the Director of Human Resources, because those people formed the management team.
Right, okay. Well, on page 40, I think you'll probably find it in the pack. I just wanted to, because there are quite a few people who seem to act, particularly in housing and regeneration.
Gregory, sorry, what tab's in that page 40? Sorry.
I don't know, it's page 40 of...
What tab are you on there in that?
It's the meeting pack.
No, it's a meeting pack.
Page 40.
Page 40 of the meeting pack.
It's second
The
page.
section after the briefing by Mr. Cook.
Okay, yeah.
It's just got a whole series of names and then the times that they were appointed and then ceased being in the position.
Yes.
So if we start at the Director of Housing and Regeneration, you see a whole series of people there who were acting, most of them for quite short periods.
Yes.
I think those are all accurate. So H. Walker was only in for a few months.
Yeah.
S. Graham was only there for 3 months.
Yes. Yes.
John McPeak for 6
Yes.
months. Helen Walker for a month. G. Flynn for about a year, no, not even a year, 6 months.
Yeah.
So, in that position, the only person who was there for quite a period of time was C. McCaughey, is that right?
Colin McCallie.
Colin McCallie, right. So, that's accurate in terms of the time that he was there.
I'm not.
Your recollection?
No, just when you point that to me, this is the first time. I think Colin couldn't have been there to the 30th of November because the reason the other people were acting was because he wasn't there.
Right.
Right? So the reason Helen Walker is acting is because she's acting because Colin McCallie had left the organisation.
Do you remember roughly when Mr. McCallie had left?
Well, I assume it must have been around the time that Helen Walker started to act. So he must have left around about the beginning of 2010 or the end of 2009.
Okay, that's useful. Okay.
And that was, sorry, just for information, that was provided to us by the Housing Executive, that chart, so.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I think what the Housing Executive done is, although Colin was still on the payroll as an employee, he would have resigned with effect from the 30th of November 2011, but he was not in post prior to resigning.
Right. But Mr. Macaulay was there up until a period of round about April 2010 anyway, for quite some time before that, for about 11 years.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
Okay. So, in that position, he would have been certainly the most long-standing person, given that all the others were acting for quite a short time. Would that be right? All the others seem to have been acting up for a few months.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
So
After he had left, they were acting up in that position. Yes.
So in the period up to the period of time that we're interested in, Mr. Macaulay seems to have been the longest-standing, most senior person in that position. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, he was the director of housing and regeneration up to.
So that's one person we've got there who was there for quite a long time in a very important post. Now then, let's look at director of corporate services. Again, there seems to have been a number of people there acting. John McPeak acted for a month. Mr. Bailey acted for about 7 months, and Paul McQuillan for about 6 months. Now, Mr. McCartney, he came much later. He's currently in post, only appointed this year.
That's right.
So for the period of time that we're talking about, you would seem to be the person who's got the most length of service there, that position.
That's right.
Right. So then that puts...
And I was, by the way, I was director of corporate services and deputy chief executive.
Oh yes, I'm coming to that.
Together.
Don't worry, I'm coming to that. So then let's move up then to deputy chief executive. And we have Mr. McPeak and yourself. Mr. McPeak was only there for a few months, but you were there for 12 years.
That's right.
Right. So then in terms of deputy chief executive, again, you're very much in the frame, Mr. Cuddy, in terms of length of time.
Yeah.
Right. Now, and then we move to chief executive. Mike's Lightbody is currently there, only just appointed, so that leaves us with Mr. McPeak, yourself, and Paddy McIntyre.
That's right.
Now, Paddy McIntyre was there for a long time, but left in 2010. So he certainly was there for quite a bit of time that we're interested in, as you were, short time.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So then, in all these positions that we've looked at, that you've said are really the most senior people, we really come down to 3 people. We come down to Paddy McIntyre, Colin McCallie, and yourself, in terms of seniority and length of time in that senior position. Out of all those people.
No, I mean...
Right, so who else have we got?
Well, my definition of seniority was the definition I gave you, the members of the senior management team. And included in the senior management team was the director of design and property services, the director of personnel, or management and personnel, it's called there. I mean, the lady there is Maureen Taggart. I mean, Maureen had been in the Housing Executive for 40 years.
Okay, so we'll put Maureen Taggart in as well then.
And the other person would have been the director of finance.
Okay.
And the final one then would have been...
Sorry, who are we talking about now?
The director of finance at that time, until he acted up, was Clark Bailey. If you see, he came in 2007 to 2011.
Okay.
And just above him, the other senior person was the director of design and property services, was John McPeak.
Yes.
Went to 2010 and then transferred over to act up in the corporate services.
Okay. Right. So we've got Colin McCallie, Stuart Cuddy, Paddy McIntyre, Maureen Taggart, Mr. Bailey, Clark Bailey, and John
McPeak.
Right. So can we settle them on that? They would be the core people at an exceptionally senior level in the organisation who were there for much of the time in which we're interested in. Would you accept that?
Well, if the time you're interested in...
Up to and including 2011.
Yeah, although some of them might have... I mean, as you say, Paddy left in December 2010, so he wasn't there for that critical period.
No, but he was there up to 2010, up to the very end of 2010.
That's right, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, do you think then we should take Paddy McIntyre out then?
No. I'm just... I'm not nitpicking, I'm just making sure that one of the critical periods that you're looking at, it seems to me, is from January 2011 to the end for that 6 to 9 month period. And the point I'm making is at that time, had he left it 2010 and there was somebody acting up, which was me, then John McPeak had moved across. He was still there. Colin McCallie, although it says November 2011, he actually left around about 2009, 2010.
But there are 5 or 6 people, of whom you are one,
Yes.
who would have been at one of the most senior positions for a prolonged period of time, up to and including 2011.
Yes.
Okay, right. Now, the current chairman of the Housing Executive has described in a very forthright way what he believes the position was in relation to contracts before he arrived. Are you saying that those 5 or 6 core people were unaware or were aware of the position as he has now described when he has come into post?
So how did he describe it?
He described it in fairly forthright fashion, that it was a bit of a shambles.
I think my view would be that view was a view he gave in retrospect, having found out what happened. When he came into post, he wouldn't have been aware of that, the chairman.
No, but you would have been, and the other 5 would have been.
No.
You weren't?
No, I wasn't aware.
Okay.
Because as I said to Mr. Wilson, the first time I became aware of the scale of this was when this was raised at the Audit Committee, and the chair of the Audit Committee, that was the vice chair of the board at that time, commissioned this report.
Right.
And the reason I said that was the Audit Committee, I mean, believe it or not, I think this is quite ironic, it was a very active Audit Committee. And even the Northern Ireland Audit Office was at it. DSD was present. The senior management team, as we identified, the 6 senior directors, including the chief executive, was there. 3 or 4 board members were there. I mean, that committee had been a very active committee for many, many years. And it was only really with the whistleblowing and the forensic report that the scale of this became aware.
Yeah. So are you saying then that those 5 or 6 people, including yourself, were totally unaware until that point? Is that the case?
I'm saying I was unaware. I'm assuming that the other directors...
Right, yeah, well, I'm glad you said that, because...
I'm assuming they were.
That's fair enough.
Having said that, that's not to say that they didn't think there was any issues. There would have been issues thrown up by audit reports.
Yes.
But the view was those were being managed on an ongoing routine basis.
Yes, but let's stick with these 5 or 6 people who are the core, long-term, exceptionally senior people in the organisation. Would it be your understanding that if any of them, you say you weren't aware, and we accept that you weren't aware, would you have expected any of the other 4 or 5 people, if they were aware, to have mentioned it?
Yes.
Right.
Well, sorry, let me qualify that. The Director of Housing and Regeneration and the Chief Executive were very, very close, not only as senior officers, but as friends, okay? And the view was that things would have been shared between those 2 officers that would not have been shared with other senior officers. For example, the example that I gave regarding the meeting with Mr. Cushnan, I was totally unaware of that meeting happening at the time, and totally unaware of the fact that there was a threat to terminate the contract and then a decision was taken. I was totally unaware of that. I would imagine most of the other directors, other than the Chief Executive and the Director of Housing and Regeneration, would have known about that. Possibly, I would think not.
But only you and Mr. McPeak had served in a multiple of capacities in this senior position? You were the only 2, according to this sheet that we have.
Well, the only capacity I acted in was as Chief Executive. I had always been the Director of Corporate Services and Deputy Chief Executive. That's one post.
Yes, but it's 3 separate roles at 3 different times.
No. The Director.
Well, then the sheet's wrong then.
Yeah, well, you see where the sheet says Director of Corporate Services, Post Escutty?
Yes.
Well, that, from 1st of March 1998 to the 31st of December, I was the Director of Corporate Services stroke Deputy Chief Executive.
Yes. And then after that, you became the Chief Executive acting.
Acting. And then I reverted back to my substantive post.
Yes.
Yes.
So you held those different roles at different times, very senior roles.
Those two,
But-
yeah, yes.
Now, so you've said that you weren't aware that you were not, you're not aware of others being aware, I take it, from your evidence. That's what you said.
At that time, no, I would have been totally unaware.
Okay. Now, these senior people here, because you'd mentioned a couple of times about when the issue of Red Sky was discussed, that there had been a quote-unquote sectarian issue raised. You'd mentioned that a couple of times.
No, I was asked whether the decision to terminate the contract, was there a sectarian issue there?
Yeah.
And I said, no, it had been raised at the meeting with the elected representatives.
Yes. Yeah.
But no, we said there was no.
Oh, I understand that, but you did refer to the fact that that had been raised.
Yes.
Right? Now, see within this group of people at the top,
Yes.
who'd been there for such a long time, were you aware of, in the public domain, by myself and others, that there was an issue about the actual composition of the housing executive itself
I was.
during all that time, or just part of it?
Just part of it.
Would that have been towards the end, or what?
It would have been. I mean, I remember meeting you on the issue and describing to you what we were doing. But I was aware that from time to time the Director of Human Resources, Personnel and Human Resources, had indicated that the composition of the housing executive had been raised by a number of people, including yourself, because that composition appeared to be skewed towards one community rather than the other. And in fact, it went to the board and the audit committee, and the Director of Personnel and Management Services explained that the issue, as she was aware of it, was that getting both communities, let's be Catholic and Protestants, getting the Protestant community to apply for jobs, but once they did apply, the allocation and success of those jobs reflected the composition of the applications. And so the positive action plan was to try and get more applications from the Protestant community. And when I met you, I introduced you to one of her staff, and her role was to go around a number of schools, etc., promoting the housing executive as an employer so that we could get some equalisation on those applications.
Yeah, but to come to the nub of this then, for a period of time, you were aware that there was significant underrepresentation of the Protestant community and people getting jobs with the housing executive. Is that right?
I was aware that was an issue, yes.
Right, okay. Would your other colleagues in this senior series of people, would they have been aware as well?
I would have thought so.
Right. Okay. So whenever then the issue of the alleged sectarian issue in relation to Red Sky would have come along, would that have been after you would have already been aware of an issue around the housing executive as an institution? Which would have come first there?
I think we need to be...
The reason, the
Sorry,
first
Stuart,
time...
just let me take this through here. I think we need to be very mindful of where this is going. If there's a specific question that needs to be asked of Mr. Cuddy in relation to what defined the sectarian issues that you describe it as and have referred to, then I think the question needs to be posed, because we're now dealing with composition of the housing executive staff in terms of community balance and so on and so forth, which is one issue. Then there's another issue which was raised: was there any sectarian influence in relation to how the housing executive was dealing with Red Sky? Because that's a separate issue. So we need to put the question directly rather than mix two issues into one, which I have to say is really unhelpful, and I will rule on it if it goes any further.
You can rule if you wish, Chairman. The issue is very clear and they are directly linked. They are directly linked.
You need to ask the direct question.
And I am. So, can you recall if the issue that some of us raised in terms of the overall composition of the housing executive institution, of which you and 5 others were at the core for a long period of time in the run-up to 2011, was that before or the period of time that you started to get involved and interested in the issue about the minister coming to you about Red Sky and then this alleged inference of sectarianism about Red Sky? Which would have come
The
before the
issue
other?
of employment
Yes.
was on the radar well before Red Sky, because we had, as you know very well, we have the Equality Commission who would issue reports. All of those reports would come to the board and the audit committee, so there was always a lot of discussion and a lot of hard work, I may say as well, to try and deal with that issue, to boost applications so that in fact we could get the balance that we wanted.
That's the point I want to get to, Mr. Crowley.
Yeah.
So, when you come to 2011 and you're dealing with the issue of Red Sky and you're responding in correspondence, the 5 of you are aware of a perception in the wider community for a long period of time about the housing executive as an institution. You're aware of that already before Red Sky hit the scene.
Let me clarify. I'm aware that there were a number of concerns amongst elected MLAs and then probably amongst the community as well. But the other thing I found as well, when I went around, as you know, the Housing Council every month, which moved right across the province, I was absolutely astonished at the support the Housing Executive got from councillors of all backgrounds and denominations. And many of them, none of them have ever come up to me and accused us of being a sectarian organisation. Equally, I've met an awful lot of people in the public, friends and relatives and acquaintances. And again, while some would have a view, oh, the Housing Executive only employs one sector, by and large that was a very, very small minority.
Okay. But just to summarise and to conclude, we've managed to get it, with all these people in all these positions, we've managed to narrow it down to about 5 or 6 people who were at the very senior positions for a period of time before and during the Red Sky issue. They, according to your evidence, would have been aware of the issue in the community regarding the housing executive as a body and difficulties it was having in terms of getting a more equitable workforce. And then in 2011, the issue of Red Sky arose. And you are informed, or there is an allegation made to you that you refute that there may be a sectarian undertone to dealing with Red Sky, that you refute as the housing executive.
I refuted was any discussion around the contract and the pros and cons of that contract, and then the decision to terminate the contract. There was no question whatsoever of any sectarianism, none whatsoever.
Right, yeah. But you were aware at that stage that the other bigger issue was out there.
I was, but I was also surprised, interestingly enough, that a link would be made at that time between the wider employment issue and that contract issue with that particular contract.
Why were you surprised?
Because I felt they were totally separate issues, and I felt that there was an acceptance that we were bending over backwards, very sensitive to the issue that we didn't have the proper balance between the two communities, and that we were striving to deal with that.
So, just, I'm sorry to go on here, but I'll finish with this one. So, just to get it clear, you were surprised, even though you accepted that out there in the public domain there had been, from a number of public representatives, concerns about the recruitment practices and policies of the housing executive, which you were well aware of, and you said all your senior colleagues were well aware of, and then an issue of religious bias, perceived religious bias, and an individual contract comes along, and you as an organisation were surprised that that should be the case.
Yeah, because I mean, maybe
even though you knew about the other issue for years.
Maybe I was being very naive, Mr. Campbell, but I saw the issue of the employment as a totally separate issue, and an issue to some extent that had been outside our control as well. That if you, I mean, the issue was that we were not getting sufficient applications from the Protestant community. But once those applications came in, the allocations of success of the jobs was in the proper and appropriate percentages. So our job was to try and get more applications. And in fact, I met you and explained to you what we were doing. We'd actually appointed a person to go round a number of schools promoting the housing executive as an employer. So perhaps naively, I assumed that most people would accept we were genuinely trying to redress that issue, but it wasn't totally within our control.
Okay, and for the record, the suggestion that there may have been some sectarian undertone was not relating to the housing executive decision-making process, but rather the source of complaints against Red Sky. That's where the sectarian issue was being alleged, not that the housing executive, who may have had a particular workforce balance, were acting in a sectarian fashion because they had that perceived workforce balance. I think it's two separate questions, so we're going to leave it that particular issue has been well aired, and I think we overextended what we should have done on that particular issue, but nevertheless, it's dealt with. Jim?
Yeah, I'll be quick, just a couple of points. Going back to the request by the Minister in the letter of the 1st of July to extend the existing Red Sky contract for 6 months.
Yes.
Now, did you say to us that in the basket of contracts that you had for this response maintenance, that there was a contractual obligation if one contractor fell out of the scheme to redistribute the work to the others already contracted?
My understanding is that there is within the contract at that time, whether it now is the case, that if a contractor, for whatever reason, is not able to meet the obligations of their contract, the work is first offered to what's known as the adjacent contractors, those contractors who would be working in districts adjacent to the district which required the contract.
So when the Minister said he wanted 6 months to allow an open procurement competition for the Red Sky contracts, was that even legally possible?
I don't think it was, because, and I'll tell you why. If you look at the letter from our chairman to Will Hare, which is the letter of the 1st of July, and
yep.
I think he sets out on the second page I think he makes the point in that letter about us being potentially liable to other contractors if they took legal action. If it's not in that letter, it's some letter.
I certainly have read that, yeah.
There's something in some of the correspondence which says that...
Yeah. So
it may be in the letter to the Minister, but I had read somewhere that we could be liable to legal action if we did not offer...
And that's because it's your belief that there was a cross-contractual obligation
that's my understanding.
to redistribute the work amongst those
that's my understanding.
who in the previous procurement have been successful.
Yes.
And of course, the effect of, it'd be pretty elementary, but the effect of extending the contract for 6 months would mean that Red Sky, the one administration, would go on doing that work.
That's right. My understanding...
And they were the ones you had the adverse findings against.
Yeah. My understanding was that NewCo would take over from Red Sky, and NewCo would continue to employ the same staff and the same management team as previously. That it would
during that 6 months?
Yes.
And at the end, and also if there was fresh procurement at that time, NewCo would then be in a position to bid for that?
Yes. That would be my understanding. So long as it met the criteria under what they call construction line. There is an organisation called construction line, and you have to meet certain criteria in terms of turnover, etc., etc.
Yes, because last week we had evidence from an official in the department which said that it was their understanding that Red Sky was making it clear that they wanted to form a new company to supersede Red Sky and take over the Red Sky contracts. And that accords with what you understood.
Well, it also accords with, there's an email between the administrators and either myself or, I'm trying to remember, Declan, who's the procurement manager, which talks about the only way they could extend the contract would be if the administrators allowed NewCo to do the work.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, nominally, the administrators would still have overall oversight.
Yes.
So there's correspondence in here.
So did it seem to you that's what the Minister was seeking to facilitate?
Well, whether he was aware that that would be the implications, I mean, I don't know if he would have been aware of that being the implications. I mean, the time frame of 6 months would have allowed that to happen.
But we know from the meeting of the 27th of June, which Mr McCausland attended with Red Sky representatives and departmental officials, from which you the housing executive, were excluded, that was very clearly the intent. Isn't that right?
So what are you reading from?
I'm reading from the minute. Tab 8.
Oh, yeah.
First page?
Yes. First page of tab 8. If you go down to the fourth paragraph.
I've seen this before.
Right, okay.
Maybe-
So take a moment.
Yes, I see that they're talking about, yeah.
The paragraph that begins, Peter Cook gave the Minister
Yes.
a brief history to the company and advised on how they were trying to establish a new company to acquire the entire Red Sky business, including Bel Air, from the Administrator.
Yes.
This latter company had already been sold, and the focus was now on the maintenance side, a large part of which included the housing contracts, which are due to expire on the 14th of July. This created concerns for the future existence of the company, as without the housing contracts, the business was not viable.
Yeah.
So from that meeting on the 27th of June, it was quite clear that Red Sky were trying to form a new company to take over where Red Sky had left off. And 4 days later, the Minister writes to you asking for the extension of the contracts, the consequence of which would be that Red Sky, or a renewed Red Sky, would carry on for that 6 months and in that time be able to compete for new contracts.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
And I mean, I think we said in our letter of the 1st of July the concerns about potential for major conflict of interest. Again, going back to this whole issue about the Minister getting involved in this particular procurement.
Okay.
Thank you.
Michael, it's the last speaker.
It'll be very, very brief because I know you've been through a fairly arduous morning. Past performance, would that have been taken into account in the issuing of any new contracts of this nature?
Well, that's an interesting point, because one of the issues that was flagged up and which intuitively for me did not make sense was we were told that you cannot use past performance as a basis for letting a new contract. And my initial reaction when I heard that was, that's absolute nonsense. Or if it's nonsense, it's not right. It should happen. Past performance should be a requirement of letting new contracts, and I was told legally under EE procurement legislation you can't do that.
And that would have pertained to the issuing of any new contracts arising from this pot of stew, in other words, the next contracts that were issued?
Yes, unless, presumably, if a contractor had been found guilty of fraud or something, a criminal charge. But in terms of past performance, we were told we could not.
What would the case be if a company was under investigation for suspected criminal activity or fraud?
Initially, the view was that you couldn't do anything. But I am aware that we actually challenged that. And subsequently, there was a contractor who was under investigation. And we decided that, irrespective of what EU procurement would be, we would not let a contract to that particular organisation on the basis that let the organisation in court challenge us. And the company did not. No, I think it was a small contract, and I think it was to do with a disability type contract. You might be aware of that one. No.
Don't be surprised.
But what we did do was, on that occasion, we decided we would test the principle, and the contractor didn't challenge us on it.
And in a case where any contractor had ceased to trade or become insolvent or lost a contract, if any new company arose from, like a phoenix from the ashes of that, would that arise free of the incumbencies of past?
Yeah.
It would arise free.
Well, my understanding would be on the basis that many of these companies have got what's known as limited liability. They're limited companies, and therefore they would not. I mean, and you've seen. I mean, we've all seen this.
They wouldn't inherit the difficulties that may have resided in their previous form of existence.
Yeah, they would have no liabilities going back to the past. No.
In such a hypothetical scenario, would any other companies who may be under investigation for similar misdemeanours find themselves disadvantaged in any way in any procurement process? Possibly.
If a procurement was happening now or at that time? At that time, my understanding
might have arose from this.
My understanding was that unless we had very good proof of malpractice, we would have great difficulties excluding them from retendering. And the reason I say that was, from memory, when we terminated this contract, we didn't terminate it on the basis that the contract was terminated given 3 months' notice, meeting the contractual responsibility of the contract. In other words, we didn't say we're immediately terminating the contract for whatever reason. We said we're unhappy with the performance of the contract, and in line with contractual responsibility, we're giving you 3 months' notice. Right? So we went through a proper legal process, which meant that the contractor could not challenge the basis on which we were terminating the contract.
Obligations have been discharged. And lastly, one very last point. At what stage, if you can remember, did you first become aware of NewCo or whatever it was called?
I think I became aware of NewCo when I saw the letter, which I have somewhere here.
The one 4 days after?
From the administrators.
The administrator?
Yeah, the administrators wrote a letter to... Yes, it was when we were trying to seek clarification on whether the administrators could continue to service the contract for 6 months. They wrote a letter, which I see if I can find it, which referred to NewCo.
There's an email in the 23rd.
It's an email.
It
is an email.
23rd of June, maybe page 1 of...
Which tab would that be?
It's in the same tab.
Tab 7, I'm told.
Tab 7.
Oh,
Now, to be fair, Mr. Copeland, that was the first time I had formally seen that NewCo. There had been rumour. That following the meeting with the minister, that a new company was to be formed. What struck me was that it was called NewCo. Now, maybe NewCo was the abbreviation going to be for a new company and wasn't going to be the official name of the company. But that is why it stuck out in my mind, the whole question of NewCo. Is there a... Is it...
On the first page, on tab 7, there's a reference to the
27th of June.
The very first page?
very first page is, I think, paragraph of successful management team. So it's good morning, Stuart. The letter starts off.
Yeah.
Or the email starts off. Is that the one you're referring to? Second paragraph, is it?
Yes. Yeah, although I thought there was another memo from the administrator Michael. I'm trying to remember Michael's last name.
Michael Jennings, is that? Michael Jennings?
Michael Jennings, to either myself or to the procurement manager and the housing executive, Declan's last name.
Declan Allen.
Yes, clarifying that what we were doing, we were writing to the administrator saying, can you manage the contract after the 14th of July for 6 months? And they wrote back and said, it wasn't no, but they said they could only service the contract if NewCo were able to actually manage it on their behalf.
Yeah.
And that was the first time I remember seeing NewCo.
That is, I think, in tab 13. There's a series of from Declan Allen.
Declan Allen, yes. Was the email to Declan Allen?
There's emails to Declan Allen and Allen. What was that here? Number of them. If you're not sure and you can't find it, then we need to.
Yes, it is. I see it there. The page isn't numbered. Sorry, page 8 of tab 13. The very bottom email from Michael Jennings to Declan Allen. And in the final paragraph there, I confirm that we did discuss the question as to whether trading for a further 8 weeks post 14th of July, or if necessary even longer, for a 6-month period could be facilitated. And this could be facilitated with the assistance of NewCo, acting as management agent on behalf of the administrators, albeit the weekly payments from the NHE would still be made to the administrator's account, and the NewCo would be utilising the administrator's employees to fulfil the contract requirement.
Okay. Okay, Michael, you help me enough. You put the question, so.
Yeah. I was just, Chair, with respect, going to ask Stuart, haven't had the benefit of reading that letter, albeit at very short notice, the very first one in tab 8. Regarding the minute rather within
tab 8?
Yeah, very first one. Regarding the meeting the 27th of June 2011.
This is a meeting with yes.
Yeah. I'm asking you for an opinion, but in reading that, could you give a view as to what you think that meeting is actually about?
I don't think, in fairness, I don't think Stuart Critics expected to give an answer on that one.
I understand.
Okay, so you're not
required.
You're not required to answer that, Stuart. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I'm quite.
Well, no, because you can't speculate on behalf of other people at the meeting if you weren't there. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Stuart.
Okay, Michael, happy enough for that. Can I ask you just a final question for myself, because this was raised early on, and rightly so, it was pointed out, Stuart, that you yourself were a senior official part of the management team for a long period of time, and as Director of Corporate Services now. I know you referred to this earlier, and I think it's important to clarify. And we also dealt quite extensively, I think, last week during an evidence session around what I think most of us would say that over a number of years, Colin McCauley directly was engaged with matters around contract management and compliance around the Red Sky company. And because the reason why, I mean, it was pointed out earlier on that you yourself were a senior official, you were Director of Corporate Services. You suggested early on there that Colin McCauley was actually the director responsible for managing that in terms of line management. I just want to have that explained, because if you're the Director of Corporate Service, most of us would think that you would deal with the financial matters, but you clearly in your evidence said that Colin McCauley was dealing with that line our evidence that was presented to us in detail showed that year on year, Colin McCauley and I think Paddy McIntyre, at least on some occasions, were engaged in dealing with issues of concern around costs associated with Red Sky contracts. And all of those engagements year on year actually resulted in a considerable settlements at a much reduced sum. It may well be entirely legitimate. Were you aware of that process? Were you involved in that process, or had you any concern?
I mean, it's very, very interesting. And I mean, when I was appointed as Director of Corporate Services, Deputy Chief Executive, the Director of Corporate Services was meant to be quite a large department, and it was meant to include a range of support services, including finance, personnel, legal services, etc., etc. Now, for whatever reason, after I was appointed, a number of those functions did not come into my division, right? And therefore, I was left with a range of other functions, but I did not have personnel or finance or legal services, which normally would be part of the corporate services portfolio. And I think the reason my post, before I applied, had the tag of Deputy Chief Executive was to reflect that it was a very senior post with those range of functions. Now, why those functions never crossed over is speculation. I mean, I know for a fact that an external appointment at that time had not been considered to be the way forward. And when I was appointed, maybe there was a review of functions and services. But to get back to your point, no, the finance function and the management personnel function remain separate as director posts, as reflected in the management structure that I discussed with Gregory Campbell.
Okay. Okay. Stuart, is there any other points that you want to make to add to anything that you've covered or been asked to cover today? Is there anything you feel you need to make?
Well, there was just one thing I suppose I would like to say, and shortly before I retired, there was a letter sent from the Minister to the new chairman of the Housing Executive. And in that letter, it was quite a long letter, and he gave a history of the Red Sky issue. And to me, it was a revisionist approach to what actually happened. But in that letter, I think I was the only officer named. And the implication was that he referred to the chairman. I don't know if he mentioned the chairman, but he mentioned me. And the implication was, by naming me, that I was at least partially, if not significantly, responsible for what happened with Red Sky. Now, I was so concerned about that I raised it with the board. And on the basis of that, there was correspondence between the new chief executive, John McPeak, and the permanent secretary. And the time I was leaving, it still was not resolved. So before I left, I asked the chief executive in one of his letters that he was pursuing this issue to make a statement, because I needed that statement for future reference. And I retained a copy of that letter. And in that letter, virtually the final paragraph says, I mean, this letter, and I'm quite happy to give you a copy of this, basically is John pointing out that it was very, yes, the letter said, further, this is a letter from the Minister, further, the then Chairman Brian Rowntree and the Acting Chief Executive pointed out they had been aware of the failures of Red Sky for some years. So the Minister stated in the letter and was using that to imply that we had been aware of this and we had done nothing about it. Now, because of that, and because I was about to retire, I spoke to the Chief Executive and asked him to include the following in his letter back, which he did do. It is a matter of record that in Stuart's time with the Housing Executive, it has never had any evidence, cause or reason to believe that he acted other than in an open, honest and professional manner in the best interests of the organisation. Now, I felt I had to have that included in light of the letter from the Minister, which I believed was targeted at me and misrepresented my role. I don't know what happened following that, whether there was further correspondence. But at that time, I do recall that one of the letters back from the Permanent Secretary did seem to suggest that what the Minister had said was fair game.
Okay, well, I mean, can I then just simply say that you put that on the record this meeting? We have not had any sight of that letter, but we will now take note of it. The members will consider it, and then we'll deal with it in whatever way we think is necessary. The committee will deal with that. And is there anything else that you want to? Is there nothing else you want to put on the record? Or
no, and could I clarify? The only reason I raise that is I do not know what evidence will be given to the committee, and whether I would ever have a chance of commenting or rebuttal. So I think it's important to have that on the record as an independent source from John McPeak, who was the Chief Executive at that time.
I was just going to make the point that obviously this will not be the end of the matter, because clearly we have to assess the evidence that we've heard so far, and we'll continue to hear in the next wee while. This will be a two-way process. You could expect we may well want to come back to you, and you feel free to come back to us if you think there's anything at any time that needs to be added to, or you want to clarify or seek some further information or whatever on. It's an open door, two-way process until the inquiry is concluded. So could I thank you, Stuart Cuddy, for your attendance here this morning, and it's been a long enough session. I think there's been an open and honest and frank exchange this morning. So could I thank you for that? And,
okay, thank you.
We likely will be following up with yourself, and likewise the invite remains open to yourself.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. Thank you, members.
Thank you. Could I suggest, members, that we adjourn for 10 minutes just for comfort?
Before you do that, could we ask that the correspondence that Mr. Curry has just referred to from the Minister, etc., have we got that?
Don't think so.
And we should be looking for that.
Yeah, but I mean, we will certainly follow up.
Just would be shortly after the new chairman of the Housing Executive was appointed, so that would have been probably near the end of 2012, beginning of 2013.
Okay. I mean, we'll follow that up. Okay, Claire, are you happy enough? Sure, thank you very much for that. Members, we'll take 10 minutes comfort break, and then we'll be...
We're going to sit on there.
Northern Ireland Assembly, Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly 29.
And we'll resume where we left off on the next item on the agenda, which is the October Monitoring Round, the departmental briefing. Andrew. Just to the record, we're now formally resumed in business in committee, and first of all apologise to the department, Andrew, Deborah and your colleagues for the fairly long delay I've had here this morning. I know you have a lot of other very important work to do, so I do apologise on behalf of the members here. We did not expect that the earlier session would have went as long as it did, so again let me formally apologise to you and appreciate your attendance here this morning. So we're dealing with the October Monitoring Round, and page 5 of people's tabled items. Without any further ado, if I just then leave it open, Andrew, to yourself and Deborah, whoever, to brief the members.
Chairman, thank you for that, and once again thanks for the opportunity to discuss our proposed submission and monitoring round with you. I'm joined by Deborah Brown today, and I'm not sure you would have all met her, but Deborah has taken over as our Director of Financial Management, so she will be presenting the detail of our proposals.
Congratulations.
Commiserations. The point, as I always make, is this is a fluid situation. It may change over the course of the next week or so. It's supposed to be in by the 2nd of October. Our Minister has seen this. We had a chance to go through it with him yesterday. He's content that I present the proposals to you today. But maybe after Deborah has gone through the detail of our presentation to you, I'll give you maybe just a few other comments on the wider situation.
Okay, thank you. Deborah, you're very welcome.
Thank you. As you're aware, the June monitoring paper outlined an immediate cut of 2.1% and postponed the 2.3% until this round. Therefore, the paper that you have been provided with outlines how the department proposes to manage the full cut of 4.4%. So, just referring to the paper that you've got, you'll see there that the 4.4% we're proposing to take 17 million out of the Social Security Agency, 9 million out of housing and 3 million out of the core to achieve the 29 million to get the 4.4%. So just moving to give you a little bit of detail on this, you'll see that 10.5 million from the SSI comes out of the welfare reform. Social Security Agency was allocated 36 million for welfare reform under SR 2010. 25.5 million of these monies have been committed, which just leaves the residual of 10.5 million to be surrendered as a contribution to the 4.4%. In addition to that, then, there are further savings of 6.5 million coming out of the Social Security Agency, and the agency has indicated that this has been achieved through the robust contract management, some strong audit and challenge, and new contractual arrangements. Also, a very robust approach to staff and vacancy management during 14-15. Then moving on to housing, there's a technical issue here where there is a corporation tax liability in the housing executive, and we have been able to reclassify that and clarify that it is actually a scoring against the AMI expenditure, and as a consequence that actually releases 5 million of DEL expenditure which we can now contribute towards this cut. In addition to that, we are anticipating a reduction in the deficit grant to the housing executive. Of course, there will be some implications of that. We anticipate that this will head against the home loss and disturbance payments, a reduction in the change of tenancies, and some reductions in office running costs. In the core department, then, the planned expenditure on housing benefit rates relief for owner-occupiers and tenants is anticipated to be approximately £3 million lower than was originally estimated. This is a demand-led benefit, and those estimates are provided by DFP Land and Property Services, so that 3 million can now contribute towards the 4.4% cut. So that summarises how the department is seeking to achieve the 4.4% cut, and in addition to that, then, we are also putting forward a number of bids. You will see that we are putting forward a bid of 10 million with the Northern Ireland Co-Ownership Housing Association, and you'll be aware that there was a 10 million bid also secured in the June monitoring round. We also are putting forward a proposal of 2.2 million for a voluntary early retirement scheme for the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. I would highlight, however, that we have had indications that resource bids in October monitoring round are unlikely to be met. However, we are putting that bid forward at this point, and we are currently assessing that business case. In addition to that, we are also surrendering 2 million of capital from the SSA. This is ring-fenced funding, and it's in respect of the Social Fund crisis loans, where volumes have declined by over 10% year to date. We are looking into this to understand the reasons behind that reduction and whether there are any actions that we need to take to address it. Also, we will be putting forward a bid for RRI investment for Together Building United Communities. We've agreed with DFP that 5.7 million will be provided to fund a number of NIO schemes, which are Ravenhill Road, Ravenhill Avenue, Feldon Mill and Lanyon Plaza. RRI funding will be allocated separately. It will not be part of the October monitoring round, but we are just bringing that to the committee's attention at this stage. So that concludes the summary of the proposals for this October monitoring round, and Andrea and myself are happy to take any questions the committee may have.
Deborah, maybe before we just get into the questions, I think just from the point of openness and transparency, I should say a couple of things. Firstly, as you've seen, we have presented the reduced requirement on the welfare reform budget as a contribution to our share of the 4.4% reduction in spend. There is a view that because that's a reduced requirement, that what we should be doing is providing that and also finding 29 million. So that's and then the other issue is well, you'll have heard the media that the amount that we have to find may well be increasing, subject to an executive position on that emerging. So the position may change quite significantly over time. So I think this is work in progress at the moment.
Okay, Henry, could I, just before bringing in members, could I just, I think at this stage again it would be appropriate that you'd also preface your remarks by saying that these figures aren't agreed by the Executive.
Yes.
So, it is a fluid situation and these figures may well be completely transformed. I just want to put that on the record. I think you should have said that. I just want to make one point, and that is that the bids around the ownership, I think that just represents a continuing ongoing failure of the department to address the issues around social housing provision, which you've heard repeatedly around this table. Just so I'm putting that on the record. Maggie Brady.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I suppose two questions really. In terms of the Social Security Agency and the funding surrendered in relation to welfare reform and the additional surrender, do you anticipate any job losses within the Social Security Agency? Because there has been a lot of speculation, a lot of talk around alleged possible job losses. And the other question really is around the voluntary redundancy set aside in relation to the housing executive. Is that because you're expecting a number of people to take voluntary redundancy, or is there going to be offers there in terms of downsizing housing executive staff to give people that opportunity?
Yeah, okay. The reduced requirement that you see there is a reduced requirement. It's unallocated funds, so that 10.5 million is not. It's not associated with staff salaries, so there is no staff implication associated with that. But that, again, to be quite open with you, like unless there's a resolution somehow of the very difficult financial position that that we're in, ultimately, if we're having to cut back expenditure significantly, ultimately there could well be staff implications. But it depends where we get to in all of this. We're not just there at the moment. And I suppose the NIHE proposal is seen a bit in that context, but not solely. They're looking at, there's organisational change there. They're wanting to make sure they've got the right skills in place. And I suppose to refresh that organisation in some way. And so there will be a bit of turnover and churn in the staff, and this would enable them to do that, ultimately to deliver a much better service to tenants and a much more professional service.
Just in the 10.5 million, is it possible to get a breakdown of what that might have been used for? Or?
Yeah, that would have been, it would have been used. We can give you certainly subsequently, but the whole welfare programme, we made a bid in 2010 for about, over the course of the 3-4 years, of 120 million, and we got something like 59 million, of which 36 million is the recurring allocation at the end of this year, if you've understood that. So there's there is a lot of different projects involved, in all of that. Universal credits, personal independence payments. There are IT costs and changes and all of that. So that we can give you that detail, Mickey, if you.
Just a point on that, because you mentioned universal credit. Now, all of this is predicated on the success of an IT system that can actually cope with all of this. And it's been proven very clearly that IT system has not yet been found, It's a bit like the Holy Grail.
Well,
Now, I'm not asking you to comment necessarily on that, but obviously money has been set aside, etc., for various, as I mentioned, for various purposes.
this particular area is not my area of responsibility. I think if my colleagues were here, they would point to the increasing rollout of universal credit across England. I don't know the detail, but they're going slower than planned.
11,500, and we should be at 1.5 million. It's
Okay.
a bit disproportionate, but we'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Okay, Sammy?
Yeah. First of all, could I take issue with the point that the chairman has made, because it isn't unanimous in the committee, Andrew, and that is that the £10 million allocated to the co-ownership scheme is something which I would welcome. It does lever in considerable additional money. It does reduce the pressure on the social housing programme. It does encourage home ownership amongst people who are first-time buyers of houses, and also has allowed people on low incomes to find that they can own a house cheaper than they can rent a house in the private sector. So it has lots of benefits, and I hope that that bid actually is successful. You see, just on the welfare reform, the funding surrender for welfare reform, I take it that's money which had been allocated for the work which has to be done within the department to prepare for welfare reform. Yes. Now, what kinds of things are not going to be done as a result of surrendering that money? And is it likely then that at some stage in the future that money may have to be rebid for, rebid again? And the second thing, the housing executives' money for voluntary early retirement, it wasn't a voluntary redundancy scheme, it was for voluntary early retirement. Given the pressures which there are likely to be next year, which may actually require redundancies, have we any idea whether money allocated for voluntary early retirement leads to a greater expense per person to get out of the system, as opposed to money which will be allocated for voluntary redundancies? And if so, why have the housing executive bid for the money in that form at the moment rather than for voluntary redundancies?
Okay. Maybe Deborah can come in on the second point, but on welfare reform generally, what things would not be done? Well, like we would have, there would have been more staff employed in order to do more of the work associated with the welfare reform programme. That won't take place. All of these delays push us down, out of our timetable for implementation shifts to the right. And yes, at some point, giving that money up now, we may well, once a decision is finally taken, we may well have to come back and ask for more. On the business case?
I mean, on the issue of there's a valid point that you raise. We've only just got the business case into the department, and we will be assessing it and obviously looking at what the various options that have been considered within that, and making sure that it is the value for money that it needs to be, and it's not a more expensive option that's been proposed. So we'll definitely take that on board, and we can come back to you on the detail.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Fra, and then Jim.
Chair, it's just on the back of what you said. Obviously, Sammy had made his position quite clear last week where he stands on co-ownership. And I think one of the arguments has always been that in itself, co-ownership may not suits a number of people to go down that road. But when you look at the huge waiting lists that there are for social housing, you have to take it into perspective, the impact that allocating a bidding for that fund, and especially the amounts of money that's been bid for over the past number of years. And I talk about my own constituency. There's actually 7 times more people on the waiting list in my own constituency there is in the waiting list for co-ownership. It is also believed that co-ownership, the fund for co-ownership, is a way to get round objective need, because it's spread across many different areas rather than concentrating on the housing need within particular areas. So there are many people who look suspiciously at this continued use of money and pushing it down the road of like to also add that in many of those constituencies where objective need, there are people that are in hostels, some for 3.5 years, waiting to get rehoused, and that money could be used to ensure that the rehoused with more houses getting built. Now, every monitoring round we come here, and people say, well, housing associations are not in a position to do that. But I've heard that for the last 3 years. And you see, in terms of the actual policy of making the bid for ownership, is it a departmental position or is it a ministerial position to go down that road?
Well, all the proposals are reflective of ministerial priorities. But the issue, Fran, and just on that, and I know we've said this before, there's a couple of points. First of all, and I don't think it's fully recognised, that the new build programme, we're social housing programme that we have in Northern Ireland, we now know is proportionately the biggest in the UK. It has a bigger impact on waiting lists than anywhere else in the UK by some considerable margin. The second point is that monitoring rounds can't deal with a social housing build programme because you're taking commitments, which follow through into the following financial year, and we just can't do that. Now, we are very much aware of the Assembly motion that we should be building 4,000 a year. The 2,000, which is significantly more than the 1,350 we were building last year, and is a sort of a major step forward in the right direction. That 2,000 is based not on the department's assessment of need. It's the housing executive who do the analysis for us and tell us how many houses we should be building. And that reflects the fact that we're anchored at 2,000 with a commitment to run the 2,000 through the next couple of years. But we understand your position. If 15-16 is going to be difficult, there will be a new CSR from 16-17 on, looking forward to 3 or 4 years. Our understanding is that capital is not going to be constrained as constrained as resource, and at that point, subject to ministerial priorities, they will be putting in a bid, which I would be very happy if it reflected the numbers that you would like to see in the programme compared to the numbers that there are now.
Sure, just need to come back on that. That may be the case that we're building more social houses here than anywhere else. I think in comparison, the waiting lists across the north are also substantially bigger. I think that the amount of people in housing stress is also bigger. And 3 years ago when we came here, and I've asked a number of times for a breakdown of how much money has been allocated to ownership, and we were told that the only reason money cannot be given to housing associations to build more houses is they're not ready to do so. But I was also followed with promises that we're getting to the bottom of it. And now the head of the housing association movement was sitting here this morning, and in correspondence with him, they were saying that a lot of the stuff, although there was discussions going on, lay at the door of the department in terms of some regulations that needed to be changes. But the fact of life is that there are hundreds of people in hostels. There are up to 40,000 people on waiting lists. Do you not think it sends out all the wrong messages that you would allocate money, substantial amounts of money over, let's say, a 3-year period, to an organisation that has a very small waiting list when there are so many people in dire need of housing, some of them in terrible conditions, some of them in overcrowding conditions, and that there is that belief, no matter what anybody says, there's that belief that that money has been used to go away from objective need in the building of social housing.
Well, I understand the point you're making. The difficulty that I have is that, we can't respond through an uncertain monitoring round process to take on significant commitments which impact in the following year. The monitoring round process can't deal with that. The reason that we can do it in co-ownership is that those issues, that money can be spent within this year. That's why we bid.
I don't think anybody's objecting to that, and I mean, I want to move on anyway because we're getting into debate around, you know, the integrity of all this and the need to address social need in terms of social housing. Nobody is objecting to the idea of supporting co-ownership. Nobody around this table, in my recollection, has ever objected to that at all. We understand the process around monitoring rounds. At the same token, there's quite a number of us who have consistently argued that monitoring round after monitoring round, year on year, millions of pounds are being skewed into that sector as opposed to addressing social needs. So, with all due respect, nobody has explained to me, well, people have told me that they understand our concerns, but I've never addressed them. So, I just want to put that in the record.
Can I just
and I'll let you make a last comment on it.
The points, and I remember coming back to another minister between 2007 and like 2009 or 2010. That constantly applied for money under monitoring rounds for new build. Constantly. And the other thing is that earlier this year, late last year, and I think it was actually Jim had come to this committee and said that they were looking at a thing from housing, looking to buy back thing, and that fell apart. So obviously there was movement there that would have allowed you to do it.
Okay. I mean, we could exhaust this because the point's been made, but we're dealing with a monitoring round, and you've got an answer from Andrew, which is obviously doesn't address the needs, but nevertheless, you happy enough if we take the next member? Okay, Jim.
Yeah, just a couple of things. You mentioned that things might get worse, that the executive agree further percentage of cuts. Just explain to me again, does that then inform the October monitoring round, or is that a separate exercise?
Well, I think the budget cuts will be made, and then we will have to live with them somehow. I'm not sure just of whether there's a, it'll be swept up in the October monitoring process. I think that will be left with departments to find, is my understanding. There will be a residual October monitoring process, probably dealing with the issues that we've talked about today.
Depends on timing too, I suppose. You said that there's a view that the 10 million linked to welfare reform should be additional to the 29 million. Whose view is that?
That's a view that's emerging from DFP.
And is that a view that you expect to prevail?
It wouldn't be for me to determine that.
Are you planning a contingency if that view does prevail?
Well, look, so there would be a view that if there is money that we have been allocated for specifically for welfare reform, if that is not needed, then we would have a sort of a corporate obligation to make that available to the system.
How would you resist that argument?
The difficulties then is where do we get to with this in terms of the final reduction? And if that increases significantly, then to achieve our share of the cuts and to deliver the reduced requirement has a very considerable impact on the services for which we are responsible. And there then will be a difficult choice.
Which would be?
Provide the easement and then accept a significant reduction on our services. If we are allowed to retain the easement, the depth of the cut that we need to make becomes shallower.
Would subsidise is then the depth?
Well, you use the word subsidise, it would mean that we wouldn't have to cut as far into our services.
Would any other department have that?
No, well, this would be in the commissioning letter that has come round. Departments have been advised that reduced requirements can contribute to their share of the cuts. So this would be particular to the Department for Social Development.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, could I ask yourself, or just, I know you're, in terms of the social fund crisis loans, the reduction in requirement around that and that surrender. I mean, on the one hand, you like to think that's a good thing, you know, but obviously you're saying more work needs to be done to establish what that actually is all about. Because obviously I think most of us anecdotally would think that wouldn't be really reflective of the circumstances a lot of people out there find themselves in. Are there any early indications as to what might explain that?
I haven't got that.
Okay.
We can maybe try and get that to you, Chair, but just I want to emphasise, like this is not a result of any management action. It is not. This is a demand-led service. It's just the demand is not coming at us as quickly as we thought it would.
That's what I'm saying. Like, on the one hand, it could be a good thing, but anecdotally, probably most of us assume there's some other explanation for making.
Just to point on that, I mean, obviously, you get a lot of loans applied for, and quite a lot disallowed, so it can be disproportionate. You know, because if you go back a few years, one of the reasons people weren't going to the Social Fund Commissioner, the Social Fund Inspectors, because they thought there's no point. When people were encouraged to do that, then the actual amount of grants, community care grants particularly, went up by, I think, 49%. So it can be disproportionate. Sometimes you don't get the full picture. It's maybe because people don't think it's worthwhile, even though they need it. You know, so maybe that's something when you are looking at that,
take it back.
that could be taken into account. You know. Thanks.
Okay, there's no other member indicating to ask any further questions of Andrew or Deborah. So, anything else you need to point out? If not, maybe we can conclude on this particular agenda item. Well, Andrew, thank you, and Deborah, thanks very much for your debut here. So, I will be seeing you again in the future. Members, move on then swiftly to the next item on the agenda, which is the Social Housing Reform Programme, and this is a rent policy for social housing. It's a departmental briefing, and you'll find the information on page 127 of your pack. And again, Andrew, you're still here in place, and both Jim Wilkinson and Shane Clements actually to join Andrew as well at the table. Again, just to yourself, Jim and Shane, apologies for the length of time you've been hanging around here this morning. So thank you for your patience. Without any further ado, Andrew, just want yourself and your colleagues just want to take members through the briefing.
Yeah, a few words maybe. I'm here, so again, thank you for the opportunity to go through this paper with you. Just to emphasise at the outset, we are not looking for decisions, but we are interested in your views. I think we promised earlier in the year that we would be coming back to the committee on our thinking and research as our thinking and research matured on the various elements that made up our work programme associated with the exploration of the issues to do with social housing reform. So today is about rent, and what I thought I would maybe do is just take you through very, very briefly what we're discussing in each of the sections. So the first section is about policy considerations, page 3 to 5, and that really describes the various interests and issues that need to be taken into account in determining any future rent policy. Affordability for tenants is very much a key consideration, but so too is the long-term impact of rents for the maintenance and upkeep of the properties, not only for existing tenants but also for the next generation. The rents need to be sustainable for landlords and to enable them to meet the costs involved in the provision of social housing, including finance charges. And lenders will also have a view, as they will seek assurances about the stability of the arrangements so that their investment is properly secured. And of course the taxpayer and the government will have an interest in protecting the public investment and safeguarding the interests of both tenants and the taxpayer. And if all of those interests aren't properly protected and a proper balance found, then system failures emerge. And that could present as unaffordable rents, underinvestment in housing stock, poor quality or indeed unsafe homes, or constraints on capital to fund major improvement work. So all of those issues could impact on the long-term supply of social housing. Then when we began our research, we were wanting to see what was happening elsewhere, and that set out really at page 5, the policy landscape, and that describes what has been happening elsewhere in the UK and the Republic of Ireland compared to Northern Ireland. And I suppose the key point here is to note that rent policy has been subject to detailed review in Scotland, England and Wales over the last 10 to 15 years. That has not happened here until now. In general terms, as a result, rent policies in the UK have reflected or are beginning to reflect a longer-term view than we have taken here to date. It tends to focus on both the public housing sector and the housing association sector, and they tend to provide for more coherent strategies across and within the sectors. So in terms of Northern Ireland, we have tended to take a shorter term view, 1 year at a time, and and that impacts particularly on the public housing sector. We do not control the housing association sector rents, although we encourage them to set as low a rent as possible. So the differences in policy have led to different results on the ground, reflected in differences in rents, the rents charged, more or less conversions of rents between different sectors, and differences in the capital support for new house build. And the next section then goes on to describe that. So what that section, that rent setting and practice section, sort of the main points there is that we've uncovered is that there is a disparity and lack of consistency between rents charged across the social housing sector in Northern Ireland, and tenants living in properties of a similar dwelling type and size can pay very different rents. The research demonstrated that in Northern Ireland the average housing associations and NIHE rents remain substantially lower than comparable rent in England. The NIHE rates are significantly lower than those charged by Welsh local authorities and are broadly on a par with those charged by Scottish authorities. Housing association rents are broadly comparable with those charged in Wales and Scotland. And the rents charged by ROI, local authorities and housing associations are not very dissimilar to those charged in Northern Ireland. We're also suggesting that within the Northern Ireland it is possible that the gap between the average housing executive and housing association rent may be consistent with differences in quality and the condition of properties, but we would recognise that there's an awful lot more work to be done in order to fully explain the differences. So then we moved on and looked at affordability, and that's, I know members will be very interested in this. And I suppose our findings there is that fundamentally rents must be affordable and family income is a key consideration. And we've set that out. I think some fundamental information there when we look at income levels here compared to the rest of the UK. Average gross weekly household incomes are the lowest here, 16% below the UK average, 18% below England, 10% below Scotland, and only on a par with Wales. And I suppose that's reflected in comparisons of relative poverty, which we set out at Table 8 on page 75, which shows that the average level of poverty is 20% in Northern Ireland compared to 16% across the UK. That's before housing costs. When you take housing costs into account, then Northern Ireland's poverty rates are slightly below the UK average. Another point really then that we need to consider is the drawdown of housing benefit. And we've looked at that relative to the rest of the UK, and that's thrown up some very interesting results, and you might want to explore those in more detail. But the key, Table 11 on page 19 gives you a lot of information. Proportionately more people in Northern Ireland draw down housing benefit there's a caseload here of 112.5 per thousand population in Northern Ireland compared to 101 per thousand population for the rest of the UK. But the level of drawdown is much lower. 3,300 on average in Northern Ireland compared to 3,700 and 3,900 pounds in Scotland and Wales, and almost 4,900 pounds in England. And I think it's interesting too that although the percentage of weekly income derived from housing benefit in Northern Ireland at 11% is just slightly lower than England, incomes generally here are substantially lower. We also make the point that if drawdown in Northern Ireland was on a par with Scotland and Wales, this could lead to a significant increase in the total benefit, housing benefit payable in Northern Ireland to the tune of 40 to 50 million pounds per year. We then looked at the affordability of rents compared to England, and there's various ways of doing that. The details set out in the paper, but fundamentally it suggests that Northern Ireland housing rents are more affordable than council rents in England and Wales, but rather less so relative to Scotland. And the same position is found for housing association rents. So that's really the detail of our findings. Overall, our assessment, we've said some comments there. We've commented on coherence, affordability, fairness, transparency. Our position here is much less coherent than elsewhere. There are marked differences in the rents charged by housing associations in the NIHE, and there are substantial variations in the range of rents charged for properties of a similar type. Said on affordability, our analysis indicates that social housing rents, particularly for the housing executive, are generally lower than those charged elsewhere. Fairness, there's a number of aspects. The wide variations between rents levied across the public and housing association sectors and within those sectors do appear to suggest a degree of unfairness, despite the differences are mitigated by financial support provided by housing benefit. And the level of rent collected by the housing executive, and this is something we've already showed to you, is insufficient to meet the long-term costs of stock to appropriate and acceptable standards. So that could be deemed unfair as existing tenants who are obliged to live in substandard accommodation compared to tenants who are lucky enough to get a new home. So there is standing back. If we don't get the system right, we'll end up with a two-tier system. With a number of people living in high-quality, good accommodation, and the others left in poorly maintained stock, which will have to be addressed over time. So that's really the extent of my comments. It was a quick run through. I know there's a lot in it, and we're happy to take any questions.
Okay, Andrew, thank you. It is absolutely a very comprehensive piece of work so far, so thank you for that. Again, then some.
Yeah, thanks very much for the presentation. One of the things that you mentioned is rent convergence. For most people, obviously, the housing sector rents are lower than housing associations. So for most people, when you talk about convergence, it means an increase in rent to bring them into line with housing associations rather than reduce to bring them into line with the housing sector. But it's interesting because I think in table 9, which is on page 17, talks about a number of times receive full housing benefit local housing allowance. Difficulty here in the north is there's an awful lot of people, increasingly more and more compared to say 10, 15 years ago, private rented sector. Here we have a sector which is totally non-regulated. There's something in the region of about £200 million in housing benefit every year. So when we talk about public money, I find it hard to believe that there's something in the region of £200 million public money paid every year to a sector that is simply not regulated. When we talk about local housing allowance, the difficulty for most people on benefit particularly is you are paying X amount out of your benefit. So if you take benefit at subsistence level, which is the government's statement, not mine, you're actually going below subsistence level when you pay local housing allowance, because a landlord can charge you whatever he wants in the private sector. So if you local housing allowance, as in my constituency, is £80, say, but the landlord's charging you 100 or 120, you have to make up the difference out of your benefit. So you're immediately 20, 30, 40 pound below subsistence level. You know, and if you take the sort of, there was a report out fairly recently about the average disposable income here in the north as compared to Britain. In Britain, it's £157. This is after you've paid everything. This is what you're left with. Here it was £61, so it's about a third the disposable income here. So I'm just making the point that people here, relative to whatever surveys are done, are much worse off. Even the people who work, the working poor and all of that. The difficulty is for people in terms of rent policy. In my view, unless something's done to regulate the private rental sector and to control the rents, and I have dealt with students this year who have paid the private landlords quite a large amount of deposits, won't get it back because they're told, no, you broke this, you broke that. And I've had personal experience of one of the children actually going and fixing a wall in a house and then being charged for it by a landlord because he wanted to take it out of the deposit. You know, that's the kind of thing that goes on, and that's the sort of thing the department really need to be looking at as well. Because if you look at the Housing Association rents, and we're constantly told, I mean, going back to the Saville report in 2009, where the housing sector stock was rated to be among the best in Europe at that time. That will only continue, of course, if it's maintained. But the difficulty also is when houses were bought off the shelf by Margaret Ritchie in particular when she was Minister, private developers' houses, the department had to spend about an extra 5,000 to 8,000 to bring those up to decent home standards. So it's all of these things that are happening, which, in my view, since 2007 have not been addressed. I'm just wondering, is there any plans in the future, particularly around local housing, or local rent allowance, to regulate properly the private rental sector? Because I would say probably 50 or 60% or more social housing is now being provided by the private rental sector as opposed to the executive or housing association.
Well, you're right. The private rented sector is now bigger than the social housing sector, and we spend more housing benefit in the private sector than the social housing sector. Jim, maybe we'll pick up the issues about the regulation of the private sector.
Yeah, I mean, we've discussed this a number of times at the committee. I think it's also worth remembering that the private rental sector is a very valuable housing form in that, you know, it does provide housing for, I think it's 150,000, 160,000, and around, you're quite right, around 50% of those are people who are receiving housing benefit. So we have looked at what we've brought in: the tenancy deposit scheme, the landlord registration scheme, the HMO registration scheme. We're doing all of those. We've also introduced issues into secure tenancy and tenancy agreements and done some work on that. But the committee will be aware we have committed to come back to the committee again, reviewing the regulation of the private sector. I think it is important, though, to understand, in relation to the specific element about rents in the private sector, it is it's a complex area, and some studies show that, you know, if you regulate rents significantly, which is a private and effectively a marketplace, you may reduce people's interest in providing homes in the private sector, and it does provide housing for 160,000. But we look at it, the policy of how you sort of control rents, and you pointed out the difficulty of that, is the local housing allowance, which is a housing benefit, which sort of caps the amount that an individual will get. And the idea behind that is then that, you know, if there's a high reliance, as there is, 50% of the market is on social tenants, and that should help reduce private rents if they want to access, make them accessible to individuals. And that's something that we will look at. There are a lot of challenges around it, but that's the broad scope of where we are. I think the interesting thing for us is that Table 12, which you've reflected on, local housing allowance for the private sector, where someone's having an intervention because of low income to help them access homes there. There's such a disparity between it, and then in particular, the amount of rent being paid in a housing executive home, which has a secure tenancy and maintenance. So there is differences in terms of the amount being paid to an individual to help them access housing.
But I suppose in terms of the private rented sector, because there is and the public housing sector and indeed housing associations, there's this belief abroad that people on benefit, you're rent free. That is actually legally part of your benefit. The only reason it was changed a number of years ago was for administrative purposes. So I think it builds up in the public perception that these people are all living rent free. That is actually part of their legal entitlement to benefit. The difficulty, and I go back to the point, of the local housing alliance, a lot of those people are actually living well below subsistence level. And that is something, in my view, that hasn't been properly addressed and needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed urgently because they're going further and further into poverty.
Certainly, we are carrying out research to show how private rents have changed over time and what the impact has been on that area.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, could I just ask a couple of questions, Jim? The first one is, if we look at table, mark here, the table which shows the table 2 on page 12, the discrepancy between housing association rents and housing executive houses, where the increase in housing executive rents since 2004 has been 37%, housing associations 62%, and there's now a 50% difference between the two. I mean, does that really reflect the standard, the size, and the quality of the housing?
There's a couple of caveats. There's obviously more work to be done. I mean, just for a benchmark, it's interesting to say in the same period in England, the increase in local council housing was about 55%, and housing associations was something similar, and that's what we're saying. The policies across GB in particular have seen much less disparity between the two. In relation to this particular issue, 2 points. One is the housing executive, the housing association. The number of housing associations homes have grown significantly since this period, 03-04, where they're starting to bring on board new homes every year. And part of the calculation of a new home is the extent to which the government grant has to be complemented by borrowing, and the extent to which the rent should be to meet that borrowing. And the figure we use there would be around about 80 to 85% of local housing allowance. So using that calculation automatically means that the associations will set their rents closer to local housing allowance rather than social rent. The other bit is there's some issues around service charges, and so it's the style and nature of the property, where it's driven to meet the borrowing, but also some issues around service charges. And I think we have to do some more work on it. But the key message is there's a much greater disparity between our public sector social housing, the housing executives, public homes, and housing associations, that we don't see the same level elsewhere.
And presumably that increase, while it's designed to reflect the capital cost, ability to pay the capital costs, it also reflects the maintenance cost.
Maintenance and borrowing.
So, are we, just on that basis, if housing executive rents are dragging so far behind housing association rents, are we, in effect, kind of building up a problem for the future with the quality of housing executive housing, because maintenance is going to be impacted by the amount of money which is available?
Yes, certainly. I mean, the briefing I think the committee had was, ironically, our maintenance from the original Savills goes back, because every year you don't do as much as you thought you were going to do, you exponentially increase the future requirement in terms of maintenance.
And you see, just on the cost of new housing, because there's some intriguing figures here. The capital grant in England is 20%. The capital grant in Northern Ireland is 45%. It's not expressed as a percentage in Scotland. It was £34,000 per house. I don't know what that works out at as a percentage.
It's about 1 million miles away from the Northern Ireland one, depending on the time.
Okay, and there's no percentage figure given for Wales. Is Wales the same as England? Just
no, Wales is closer to Scotland and Northern Ireland.
Well, you see, if there is that discrepancy between rents which we charge in the public sector, or the housing executive sector, and the housing association sector, and those being charged in England, where it's got to reflect the capital costs. is there a danger, and I'm just looking at it from the long-term point of view. Clearly in England, what they do is they put the rents up to reflect the capital costs, and presumably some of the money is recouped through housing benefit.
Percentages are not a million miles away from ours. They're a bit lower than ours, but not. We're maybe sitting at 74, 75%. They'll be sitting at maybe 65.
Well, maybe just finish the point on, and maybe we can then comment on it. Since the capital grant comes out of our block, any money which we get for housing associations comes out of our block. Any money which we get from housing benefit comes out of AMI, so it doesn't affect the block. Are we, by restricting rents in the housing executive tenancies and housing associations have made their own mind up, but in the housing executive sector, are we in effect or paying for future housing out of money which we have, rather than using AMI money if we were to put up rents and take it from housing benefit?
There's in England, there's a very deliberate policy of reducing the capital contribution, and that was in this last spending review, in the full knowledge that that would be picked up by a greater share of greater reliance on housing benefit. And also, I suppose, reflective of the market conditions there, that, as well as that, they were encouraging housing associations to build mixed tenure for sale or market rent, and to cross-subsidise social rent. But you're right, that's on the capital side. On if I look back on the way rents have been set here, you know, and compared to how much this is public housing rents compared to how much they've been raised here relative to the UK, there's a big difference. But we have tended to look only at one side of the equation. We haven't looked at the impact of that on our ability to maintain the housing stock. I suppose it wasn't noticed in the past because the housing executive used to collect 100 million quid a year on sales, and they would have ploughed that into maintenance. But if the rents were set at a level which was sufficient to maintain the properties in the long term, those capital sales could have been used to finance new social housing. And you're right, as a result of all of these policies over time, our Dell block is picking up a greater share of the cost of social housing than elsewhere.
And given that 78% of people in housing executive accommodation and 74% of people in housing associations houses are either on full or partial, I mean, really, we could be passing a lot of this not on to tenants, but on to central government and freeing up whatever money goes on the capital, or some of the money goes in capital grants for other housing functions.
And there's a figure in the report where if our rents were on a par with Scotland and Wales, and thus drawdown of housing benefit was on a par, there would be, now back of the envelope at this stage, 40 to 50 million pounds.
I was just going to ask you, had any work being done on what we...
That's new money. You know, it doesn't only offset, if you like, the costs of the tenants, but it's new money to the economy, which, you know, there's at the end of that, then there's jobs and all the rest of it.
Thank you, Brian and Jim.
Just one short point that's in the back. What Sammy is saying, and that is what's not taken into consideration is that there are a huge percentage of people here who are on pay who depend on housing benefit to cover their rent. And you see, when you look at all these figures and throw them into around, say we might have another 50, 40, 50, you look at the human cost of maybe putting an extra £20 a week onto somebody's rent. And what it means to them. Does it mean that they'll be out of a job because they can't afford to stay in a job, or that they'll have to go without food on 1 or 2 days a week? Does that be taken into consideration when you do all these?
Absolutely,
very much so.
You know, there's a, you know, is there a sweeter spot than where we are now? and that's about the balance. That's what I was, reflecting in the policy considerations. There's lots of different interests here. It's trying to get a balance, and yes, affordability is a big issue here. And the points that Mickey was making about the impact of the private sector rents on people's income, and all have to be put into the pot. As do the future costs of no change and the consequences of no change. So that's like it's a difficult and complex issue, but I suppose where this is pointing me is that there's some headroom here in terms of movement, but we're constrained by the fact that income levels generally in Northern Ireland are lower than elsewhere. But it's that sort of balance and trade-off. So you're quite right to make the point.
And certainly we would look at affordability, not just on. That's why we're very keen to what strikes it as affordable. It's not just assuming people are going to have benefit they're covered, because as we know, there's 22% or more, 32% people who don't. But the other side of the coin, and one thing we do have to do, and that's why we're talking about scenarios, is you look at things over time. Over time, things might have less of an impact if you take longer time to do it, a shorter time to do it. And that's why, for example, when we looked at England, they used a 15-year period to look towards this convergence, and part of their convergence was not just more fairness and transparency across the system and equality in terms of someone on the waiting list has a fair idea how much rent they're going to pay if they get allocated off the waiting list, whereas here it depends what home you're allocated. But also that over time the impact could be mitigated by taking a longer time to get there.
But to see, obviously the next point is, it's the first I've seen a report that I didn't get the minutes for today until this morning, and obviously we'll go through it. Is the argument that's been put forward here today, and I remember raising it, Jim, a couple of years ago when the social development housing programme came forward, but there seemed to be an indication then that we were working towards convergence in rents. And is that what we're talking about today?
I think it's just today's paper is very much looking at the policy landscape and says elsewhere there has been more convergence and less disparity between the two, and where that doesn't happen, there are different consequences applied in different ways. But we're very clear the decision will always be, it'll be a matter for
political decision.
This political decision, but we're just pointing out facts and information and figures here.
See, and I think you were right earlier on, and I think I'm almost at pains to say that the private rented sector does provide quite a number of good quality houses, but equally there's elements of it that provide a lot of poor quality housing. And I'm sure that whether Sammy's constituency or my constituency, the average rent as a weekly rent would be, if people are housing, that is about £80 a week, £360. And where I live, it's £500 and £550 a month. So many of the people that are in housing benefit actually have to get money from their families because they're not working. So that perpetuates and adds to the poverty that exists in areas also.
Is there not a bit of an irony here that we don't restrict rents in the private sector, so much more housing benefit can be drawn down to finance private sector building of rented accommodation, whereas in the public sector of poor quality, whereas in the public sector we use money out of our own block grant, which we use for other purposes.
It's a bit like that. Although that said, I think the point you're making is that there is an element of control of the private sector through the local housing allowance, and that it's not paid above it. But as members have pointed out, maybe that is subsidised by other income to help access the private sector. But what we've shown is that there is a massive gap between the local housing allowance and
government. But you're right. Government, through its current practice, has shown its willingness to finance rents at a much higher level in the private sector than it currently does in the public.
Yeah. Which is the point Sammy's making, but Jim, you wanted in?
Yeah, I want to take you back to Table 2 that Sammy drew your attention to. The very stark discrepancy between housing association rents and housing executive rents. How does that impact on the viability of the policy of divesting the housing executive of its properties and passing them off to housing associations.
It doesn't. I just need to. That table is a very stark contrast, and we've referenced the factors that might be contributing to it, including the new build and the issue of service charges. So if we turn to Table 5, Table 6 on page 14, that table shows on the Northern Ireland column, the first column there, the differences where we have stripped out as far as we can the service charges. So there's still a difference.
Still £20.
Still a difference. But if you look then at the housing association, look at the two-bedroom property price in Northern Ireland, £70.86, £69.51 in Wales, and the new rent for a housing association two-bedroom property is £71. So the housing association rents that are charged in Northern Ireland are not too out of kilter with the rates that are applied to housing associations in Wales and Scotland. We need to make that point. The difference, you see, the difference when you just look at the numbers, you can come to the wrong conclusion very, very quickly. When I look at the rents for the housing executive, I'm also mindful of the table that we presented to the committee in March, which showed that we had backlog maintenance problem of £750 million, £450 million needing to be addressed in the next 5 years. So, if we're not careful, we can get the wrong side of the argument here. I'm not sure. I mean, we're going to be doing all the research and all the rest of it. I'm not sure the housing association rents are the ones that are out of kilter.
But I'm thinking of the tenant of the housing executive, whose landlord may become the housing association.
Well, you see, that would all be controlled. This is why we need a rent policy. We need to control increases in rents.
I suppose maybe
year on year.
Being the specifics at the moment, our small-scale stock transfer programme, which is a small programme that's going on, and there's been a few pilots. I mean, the vote, it can be clear that the tenants have a vote, and part of our requirement is that if a housing association is making a proposal, for example, to take properties and improve them, they have to show what the rents are going to be. And where the two have happened, the tenants have said, well, we will note the rent increase and link that to what we're being promised in terms of any work or improvements that's going to be done to the property.
It could be a rent increase if they order £20 a week.
Yes, if it's clear. Well, I mean, each development's on its own, but the housing association, they're offering and making the offering, and to allow the tenants to vote, they have to show what the rents are going to be over a fixed period of time, and therefore the tenant, if they vote for a transfer, have taken the decision that I note the rent versus I note the improvements I'm being promised, and I'll make my decision on that.
And a rent of that scale of increase, a rent increase of that scale, would only ever occur if there was major improvement works done, with improvements in energy conservation and all the rest of it. The figures that I have, Jim, in my mind about Rinmore, which is only it's a very small transfer, the rents there went up by £14 a week, but the energy savings were £10. And to the extent that housing benefit was paid for, that's £10 more in the pockets of the tenant. So that's the sort of issues we have to reflect on.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, you want a brief point?
Two quick points. I mean, the rationale for Enmore and stock transfer is because we can't do your maintenance, but the housing associations can. But more recently, the stock transfers, there are houses that don't necessarily need maintenance, but there's no doubt that the rent will go up because it's housing associations. The other point I just wanted to make is, in terms of, and I go back to the local housing allowance and people having to make up the difference, people here get exactly the same benefits as they do in Britain, but we're paying more for fuel, for food, for everything, for utilities. So it's totally disproportionate, so it just increases that ever vicious circle of poverty. You know, so, and the people having to pay more out of their benefit for rent, and that's why it needs to be regulated. Because I go back to my point, a huge amount of money, public money being paid to people who have no regulation. It just doesn't.
John, can I just ask, where does this go from now? I mean, obviously it highlights a whole lot of issues, and probably does require. And I accept the point that you made, Jim, that this isn't something that you would suddenly flip the whole thing round, but it does require some longer-term strategic view as to whether we change the sources of finance for housing and the kind of structure of rents. But what's the next step with this report now?
Let's just, if you don't mind, let's just let you come in on it, and just after another request, I want to put myself there just to put something on the record, because obviously that would be your concluding remarks as to how you want to take this forward. If you have enough, Sammy. There is the issue, I think it's referred to around Scotland, for example, where at this moment in time here, there is a disparity in terms of standards, and obviously you've got the Decent Homes standards applicable and all the rest of that, but that doesn't apply to every sector. So in terms of looking at a future rents policy, can we look at some way of making sure that there is not only an issue debated around convergence of costs and charges, but actually what you're getting for that, in other words, standards for homes and services to be provided, and surely there must be a way of making sure that there is transparency, that there's consistency, that there's tenancy agreements with Steelsborough, all that. So, I mean, I know it's referred to in the report, so just whenever you're writing up your remarks as to what you propose to do next, I suppose, if you could just factor that in as well. Andrew, Jim?
Well, we're still doing work. We've got access to the rent rolls for all the housing associations and the housing executives, so we're doing very, very detailed analysis of the differences, and we want to expose then the whether or not we're comparing like with like. So that will give us more information about service charges and all the rest of it. Where do we go? Well, we need then to look. We've got the stock condition survey being done at the moment, where we are, people are assessing the conditions of about 20% of housing executive properties. And that's to update the desk research, that figure of 750 million. We're looking for a better evidence base for that. So that, for the first time, will give us, if you like, the total requirement. And then we want to look at different, I suppose, options about rent as to how that requirement can best be addressed. So it features in there. And it'll all come out in the mix, I suppose, in after Christmas or in the new year, where we've a commitment to you that we're going to look at this as no change. Some stock transferred, all stock transferred, and ditto with a rent policy. We'll be wanting to consider no change, some change, great change. So all of that has to be brought to you. We have to find a way of presenting it in a way which is, I suppose, it's understandable, because it's so complex it's going to be difficult, but that's what our intention is. Like, there's a need for, I think, a rent policy irrespective of changes in housing structures. If there is no change in housing structures, we may still want to look at a longer term rent policy.
I mean, just to add that these are sort of chicken and egg, and we described it at the start. The reform programme is almost two. There's one bit looking at structures, but there's another bit looking at the policies that the system and those structures will operate in. So our intention really is to go take this forward and bring forward a formal consultation paper where we put forward proposals for a rent policy. Those proposals will both be informed by and inform any decisions to be taken on the structures. So the key for us is to do some modelling about what the impacts would be. We also will be doing our impact assessments, quality impact, regular impact, rural impact, so that we have that policy proposal early in the new year out for consultation and discussion. But it will highlight these issues and also highlight what the consequences or what the policy might do. I think Andrew's right. A lot of the policy proposals have to come forward whether or not there's any change in structures, and so they're linked, but at the same time they can be brought forward at different times.
Okay, no other members indicating to ask any further questions. Andrew and Jim, I know you got off late today there, but if there's nothing else that you want to add to what you've already said, then can I then thank you for being here this morning and giving us your presentation. And I know Fred referred earlier on that he had difficulty accessing his committee papers, so I don't know where that applied to other members, but it's nothing to do with it. It's not Kevin's fault or anything. So whatever the technological problem was this morning.
I think we should say as well, it's an excellent paper, and it's given us really a lot of good stuff to think about.
Yeah, I think it is very comprehensive. I think members do appreciate that because it does explore everything and looks at all the options. It gives a wide range of evidence, other examples. So thank you for that, and no doubt we will continue to pursue this with yourself. So thanks very much, and again, obviously I very much apologise for the delay you've had today. Okay, thank you. Members, we'll move quickly on then. We'll lose members, or even the will to live. So the next item on the agenda would be the Job Seekers Allowance Maternity Amendment, and that's on page 156. The committee considered this SL1 on the 11th of September 2014 and was content for the rules to be made. If there are no further objections, we are content to read it into the record. Right. That the Committee for Social Development has considered the statutory rule SR 226/2014, the Job Seekers Allowance Maternity Allowance Amendment Regulations for Northern Ireland 2014, and subject to the Examiner of Statutory Rules report, recommends that it be confirmed by the Assembly. Agreed? Agreed. Thank you very much. The next item then is SR 235, the Social Security TSA and ESA Waiting Days Amendment. You'll recall that the committee divided on this on the 4th of September. And I understand that the Department obviously has advised that if the regulations are not introduced, additional costs would be incurred by ourselves here in the local grant. And the Department has written to the committee to clarify who would be exempt, for example, from serving waiting days, etc., and that's contained on page 12 of your tabled items. The rule itself will be subject to negative resolution procedure before the Assembly, and the statutory period will be calculated the 21st of October. So we're just going to put this to a vote in a second.
No, I just wanted to say, Chair, I would still be unhappy about the change because it is a cut. In fairness, Michael Pollock has given us a very comprehensive list of the exemptions, and that's people in receipt of statutory sick pay, etc., people in receipt of disability benefits, etc. The other thing that I would ask is that the Department monitor closely the number of people that will be affected by this. Because obviously there are a number of exemptions, but there will be a lot of other people who will fall into the trap of the cut.
Well, could I remind ourselves that earlier on in the mandate there were a number of SRs which the committee expressed reservations, in some cases quite strongly to, whilst they didn't object formally to the SRs for any reasons, but members across all the parties did express reservations and wanted a number of SRs and the applications of them monitored. We've not had any feedback, I don't think, on any of those, so can we just, from the committee point of view, revisit those decisions so that we can assure members that when they're looking for the monitoring and they're working with these processes, that because obviously what we'll all want is to know that our fears are not realised, but nevertheless the committee did decide that they would support various SRs, for example, but on the basis that they be well monitored and so on. And so I think it's, in respect to the committee, we need to get those back on track again. Okay, so I was just going to read this under the record. So the motion that the Committee for Social Development has considered the statutory rule SR 235/2014, the Social Security Job Seekers Allowance and Employment and Support Allowance Waiting Days Amendment Regulations Northern Ireland 2014, and subject to the Examiner of Statutory Rules report, has no objections to the rule. Those in favour? Those against? That's carried. Okay, so thank you very much, members, for that. Moving swiftly on then to correspondence, page 172 of your paper, of your pack. Are members content to note the correspondence as per the memo? Thank you very much for that, members. For work programme, 292 of your pack. Members contempt the forward work programme.
Right.
Great. Any other business?
Chair,
Stuart?
very briefly, two very quick items. First of all, the Supporting People programme, can we ask the department to provide us with some further feedback? There was an event here on Tuesday for that, in support of it. And the second one is, and this has been at the request of the political group that meets with the DOE Minister with regards to the transfer of functions to local government, which met last week, and the transfer of functions from DSD to local government, particularly in respect of community planning and economic development, and also civil servants, seems to have hit a bit of a brick wall inside DSD. So we can find out what is happening and getting a briefing on that.
Is that community planning, Stuart? And what was the second one?
Community planning, economic development and transfer of staff to local government.
Okay, members, happy enough that we do that? Okay, thanks very much. That is now adjourned to the next meeting on the 2nd of October. Thank you very much, members.